1926. Fall asleep to Hilarious History. The Cloud Traffic and the Magician's Last Act, in the narrative style of Mark Twain. Copyright 2026. James Henderson. Chapter 1. The 9-Day Siesta. By 1926, the 20th century was moving so fast that yesterday's miracles were already today's junk. It was a year where an entire empire went on strike just to see if the factories could run on tea, and indignation, a silent movie star's funeral, caused more casualties than some skirmishes, and humanity finally figured out how to project a flickering, ghostly image of a man's face across a room using a spinning disc and a neon bulb. It is a curious thing about the British people that they have long considered themselves the masters of the sensible middle path, a sort of cobblestoned highway of decorum that leads, one assumes, directly to a well-earned cup of Earl Grey. But in May of this year, they decided to take a turn off the main road and drive their carriage into a ditch just to see what the view looked like from the mud. It was called the General Strike, and for 9 days, the United Kingdom, a place where the gears of industry are usually as tightly wound as a nervous clockmaker's watch, decided that the most sensible thing to do was to stop entirely. 2 million souls, bless them, simply put down their tools. They walked away from the coal mines, the docks, the printing presses, and the trains. It was a strike of such magnitude that it could be felt in the very marrow of the nation. It wasn't a revolution of pikes and guillotines. It was a revolution of silence. The factories, which usually growled and clanked with the ceaseless dyspeptic roar of progress, suddenly fell as quiet as a church at midnight. The trains, those iron serpents that usually coil and uncoil across the countryside with punctuality that borders on the holy, sat rusted and motionless in their stations, looking for all the world like disgruntled cattle waiting for a farmer who had forgotten how to whistle. Now, when you leave a machine alone, it behaves quite well. But when you leave an empire alone, it begins to itch. The British upper classes, who have a constitutional inability to sit still when there is an opportunity to look important, decided that if the working man would not drive the bus, then the gentleman must. It was a spectacle that would have made a circus clown weep with laughter. You had your Duke of this and your Earl of that, men whose hands had never encountered anything coarser than a silk handkerchief or a silver spoon, suddenly attempting to wrestle with the steering wheels of heavy city buses. These contraptions, which require the strength of a gorilla and the temperament of a mule to navigate, found themselves at the mercy of chaps in pinstripe trousers, who still expected the vehicle to bow to them as they approached a corner. They crashed into lamp-posts with the haughty indignation of men who had been insulted by the inanimate. Then there were the university students, young fellows with more optimism than sense, who took it upon themselves to load the coal. They arrived at the docks with their stiff collars and their fine leather shoes, ready to save the nation's economy with a shovel. They lasted on average about 20 minutes. Loading coal is a profession that requires one to lose all interest in personal cleanliness and gain a healthy respect for the gravity of a sack. By noon, the students looked less like the saviors of the empire and more like chimney sweeps who had been involved in a wrestling match with a dust storm. They learned quite abruptly that while an aristocrat can give an order that rings across a continent, he is remarkably poor at shifting a crate from one side of a barge to the other. The government, meanwhile, panicked with the grace of a hen in a fox den. They produced a newspaper called the British Gazette, which was essentially a collection of stern warnings and optimistic delusions printed on paper that seemed to have been salvaged from a scrap heap. Winston Churchill, who was never one to miss an opportunity to play at being Napoleon, took over the editing. He filled the columns with the sort of high-minded rhetoric that sounds splendid in a parliament, but does absolutely nothing to get the milk delivered to the doorsteps of London. And yet, despite the chaos, despite the lack of public transport and the smell of unwashed aristocrats trying to steer heavy machinery, there was a strange, quiet dignity to it all. The strikers didn't storm the palaces. They didn't set the crown jewels on fire. They simply sat on their stoops, watched the buses veer into hedges, and waited. It was a polite standoff. It was a national cooling of the heels. It was, in many ways, the most British thing that had ever happened. The entire country had decided to go on a strike, and yet everyone remained impeccably polite while they did it. One could sit on a park bench in Hyde Park and watch a fellow in a morning coat try to explain to a tramcar that it really ought to move, simply because the driver was a gentleman and, therefore, accustomed to being obeyed. The tram, having no sense of social hierarchy, stayed exactly where it was. It was a master class in the folly of expecting the world to operate on the principles of the drawing room. By the time the 9th day rolled around, the nation was tired. The workers were hungry, the students were sore, and the aristocrats had realized that there is a profound difference between driving a motor car for pleasure and operating a commercial vehicle for the benefit of the masses. The strike ended not with a bang, but with the weary sigh of a people who had proven their point, whatever that point may have been. The machines began to clank again. The coal began to move, and the gentlemen returned to their clubs to tell stories about the time they almost drove a bus, failing to mention that they had hit 3 flower beds and a very confused postman in the process. It was, in short, a marvelous exercise in human absurdity. We pride ourselves on our systems, our schedules, and our rigid expectations of how the world should turn. Yet we are all one day of silence away from total collapse. It was a reminder that the world doesn't run on the orders of the great or the ambition of the wealthy. It runs on the humble, dirty, unglamorous labor of the people who know how to keep the wheels turning. And when they decide to stop, well, even the most powerful empire in the world becomes nothing more than a very expensive, very quiet museum of its own past. As for me, I watched it all from a distance, reflecting on the peculiar nature of progress. We are forever trying to move faster, reach higher, and build monuments to our own cleverness. Yet we are constantly tripped up by the very foundations we stand upon. It was a lesson, I suppose, if anyone had been listening. But in 1926, the world was too busy trying to invent the future to pay much mind to the present, and that, perhaps, is the greatest comedy of all. Chapter 2. Henry Ford's Weekend Gift. If you ever wish to understand the peculiar engine of the American soul, you must first study the history of the man who sold us the illusion that we could go anywhere, provided we were willing to tighten a bolt for 40 hours a week to pay for the privilege. Henry Ford, a man who possessed the mechanical genius of a god and the social imagination of a steam-powered tractor, decided, in the year of our Lord 1926, that the 6-day work week was, if not an affront to humanity, then at least a nuisance to the bottom line. He didn't come to this conclusion because he suddenly discovered a heart beating beneath his waistcoat, or because he felt a deep spiritual kinship with the weary men in his Highland Park plant. No, Mr. Ford was a pragmatist of the highest order. He had built a machine that could transport a family across the landscape with the speed of a startled rabbit. But he had a sudden, cold realization. If a man spends 6 days a week bent over a chassis, squinting at the underside of a Model T, he has no time to actually drive the thing. He has no time to buy gasoline, no time to replace the tires he shredded on the rutted pre-highway roads, and certainly no time to drive his wife and children to a picnic spot where they might accidentally realize that the world existed outside of the factory fence. So, with a stroke of the pen, Henry Ford gifted the world the 5-day, 40-hour work week. It was framed as an act of enlightened benevolence, a philanthropic masterstroke that would allow the laborer to spend his Saturdays fishing, or preferably consuming the products of the Ford Motor Company. It was the birth of the weekend as a national institution, a 2-day oasis in the desert of industry. Before this, the Sabbath was the only day of respite, and even that was often interrupted by the preacher's insistence that one spend the afternoon contemplating the eternal consequences of one's sins. But Saturday was to be the day of the American consumer. It was a brilliant, predatory, and entirely necessary invention. Ford understood that the modern economy cannot subsist on a man who only works. It requires a man who plays, and in playing, incurs the necessary expenses of the modern life. The reaction among the industrialists of the era was one of unmitigated horror. They looked upon Ford's decision as one might look upon a man handing out live dynamite to toddlers. "It will ruin them," they cried. "Give a man a day of rest, and he will undoubtedly use it to foment revolution, or worse, he will become soft and lose his capacity to sweat for 12 hours at a stretch." They genuinely believed that leisure was a gateway drug to laziness, and that the only thing standing between a productive society and a total collapse into barbarism was the 6-day schedule and a lack of spare time. But the workers, the ones with the grease under their fingernails and the metallic hum of the assembly line permanently etched into their inner ears, took to the idea with the enthusiasm of a parched man stumbling upon a spring. It was as if they had been handed a new life, a second existence that didn't involve the relentless rhythmic clack, hiss, bang of the stamping machines. I must say, there is something profoundly comical about the sight of a man who has spent his entire existence following the movements of a machine suddenly finding himself with an unscripted Saturday. He stands on his front porch, blinking in the sunlight, feeling the sudden, terrifying absence of a foreman's shout. He doesn't know where to put his hands. He walks to the corner, returns, sits in his chair, stands up again, and ultimately decides that the only thing to do is to go for a drive. And thus the loop was closed. The worker becomes the driver. The driver becomes the consumer. The consumer spends his wages on the very car he helped to build, on the oil to lubricate its joints, and on the gasoline to feed its insatiable appetite. It is a closed, self-sustaining circle of commerce that would have impressed the ancient alchemists who spent their lives trying to turn lead into gold. Except that Ford did it by turning time into currency. There was a peculiar shift in the national temperament. The 6-day man was a creature of singular focus, a cog in a great grinding gear. The 5-day man, however, was a creature of potential. Potential trouble, potential spending, potential discovery. He started to buy things he didn't strictly need. He started to take his family to places that served no discernible purpose other than to be looked at. He started, in short, to act like a human being rather than an extension of a hydraulic press. I recall watching a group of these newfound weekenders attempting to navigate a dirt road in a Model T. They were dressed in their Sunday best, or rather their Saturday best, looking as uncomfortable as a cat in a bathtub. The car, as stubborn as the day is long, had decided to bury its rear wheels in a patch of soft mud. The father, a man who had spent the week tightening the very bolts that now seemed to be conspiring against him, stood knee-deep in the muck, cursing the machine with a vocabulary that would have made a sailor blush. His wife was shouting directions that nobody could possibly follow, and the children were crying because the picnic basket had tipped over into the slurry. It was a beautiful, chaotic tableau of the new American dream. They had their Saturday, they had their car, and they had their adventure. And despite the mud, despite the engine that refused to turn over, they were happy. Or at least, they were relieved not to be in the factory. Of course, the other industrialists eventually had to follow suit. They grumbled and complained, claiming that Ford was a madman, that he was destroying the moral fabric of the nation, and that he was, at the very least, making it impossible to find decent, overworked help. But they fell into line, one by one. The 5-day week became the law of the land, not through the wisdom of the legislature, but through the hard-headed logic of the marketplace. We tend to look back at these things as milestones of human progress, as if we reached some pinnacle of enlightenment, where we decided that humanity deserved a rest. But let us be honest, we didn't get the weekend because we were tired. We got it because we were a market. We didn't get it because we needed time to reflect on our souls. We got it because we needed time to spend our wages on the fripperies of the modern world. And yet, looking at that man in the mud, covered in the grease of the machine he helped create, I cannot help but admire the irony. Henry Ford thought he was building a more efficient worker, but instead, he accidentally built a more complex, contradictory, and occasionally joyful human being. He gave us the weekend, and in doing so, he gave us the modern world, a world of traffic jams, picnics in the rain, and the constant restless urge to be somewhere else. It is a grand experiment, this modern life. We trade our hours for the means to escape the very places where we spend them. We build the cars, we pave the roads, and we use our Saturdays to drive in circles, searching for a place that feels like home, all while ignoring the fact that home is likely the only place we have no time to be. It is a comedy, truly, but it is one I find myself laughing at quite heartily, especially when I'm driving along a road that Henry Ford helped me pay for. Chapter 3. The Gray Ghosts of the Living Room. In the year 1926, humanity finally grew tired of the inconvenience of reality. It had served us well enough for several millennia, the sun rising when it pleased, the rain falling on the just and the unjust alike, and the neighbors being annoying only when one was actually in their presence. But it lacked a certain curated quality. We had already mastered the art of capturing sound, trapping the voices of opera singers in wax cylinders so they might screech at us in our own parlors, and we had mastered the art of trapping light on a strip of celluloid to tell us lies about romance and adventure. But these were static things. They were relics. We wanted something that happened now, something that could bring the world into our homes while we sat in our slippers, unwashed and unbothered. And so, in a laboratory in London that smelled perpetually of ozone and burnt patience, a Scotsman named John Logie Baird decided to capture the ghost of the world and shove it into a wooden box. Mr. Byrd was a man who looked as though he had been assembled from the leftover parts of a Victorian clockmaker's workshop, all wires, spectacles, and nervous, twitching energy. He stood before a group of skeptical scientists, men who had spent their lives measuring the distance between stars and cataloging the habits of trilobites, and told them that he intended to send a moving picture through the air without the benefit of a theater or a projector. They laughed, of course. They laughed in that polite, condescending way that men of science reserve for people who claim to have invented perpetual motion or found the secret to curing the common cold with horseradish. But Baird was not deterred by the derision of the learned. He had his machine. It was a contraption of such complexity that it seemed to be held together by nothing more than prayers and stubbornness. There were spinning discs with holes drilled into them with the precision of a bored schoolboy, neon bulbs that flickered with the temperament of a nervous firefly, and enough copper wire to conduct a symphony of electricity from one end of the city to the other. He invited them to look into the viewer, a small, dark aperture that looked like the peephole of a very pessimistic front door. And there, with a hum that sounded like a hive of bees trapped in a tin bucket, the miracle occurred. It was not, by any stretch of the imagination, a clear or flattering image. The man on the screen, or rather, the doll's head that Baird was using as a test subject, was a fuzzy, orange-tinted monstrosity that seemed to be vibrating in a state of eternal agonizing transition. It had the features of a human face, sort of, provided one squinted hard enough and possessed a high degree of artistic imagination. It blinked when it shouldn't have, disappeared into a blizzard of flickering static, and occasionally appeared to be melting. It was a ghost, truly a trapped spirit of the machine, struggling to manifest in a world that was far too solid for its liking. The scientists leaned in, their eyes watering from the strain, their minds racing to find a logical explanation for this luminous hallucination. "It's a trick," one might have whispered, though none dared say it aloud. A shadow play, a clever arrangement of mirrors. But it was not a trick. It was the television. It was the formal announcement that in the very near future the human race would no longer need to step outside to be entertained, enlightened, or profoundly misinformed. I sat back and contemplated the implications of this invention, and I must confess, the thought chilled me to the bone. Imagine, if you will, a world where the entirety of human experience, the news of the day, the tragedies of distant lands, the peddling of soap and sewing machines, is piped directly into the parlor. We have long relied on the printed word, which requires a certain amount of effort, a bit of concentration, and a healthy dose of skepticism. You can put down a book if the author is a bore. You can fold a newspaper and use it to swat a fly. But this box that brings the world to your armchair, you cannot swat a television. It will only stare back at you, a glowing, silent sentinel, feeding you whatever images it deems fit to broadcast. It is the ultimate triumph of the passive mind. Why go to the theater to see a play when you can watch a fuzzy orange man dance in your own living room? Why walk to the town square to hear a speech when you can receive it via the ether, pre-filtered and pre-packaged? It is a marvelous technology, to be sure, a testament to the fact that man can solve any problem, provided the problem is, how do we avoid being bored while sitting still? The brilliance of Baird's invention, however, lies in its very imperfection. It was so blurry, so distorted, that the viewer had to supply the details themselves. One had to work to see the face in the machine, and in doing so, one became a partner in the deception. It was an intellectual exercise, but I suspect that humanity will not be satisfied with the struggle. We will want more light, more clarity, more color, until the ghost in the box looks more real than the people sitting on the sofa next to us. And then, I fear, we shall have reached the pinnacle of our foolishness. I can envision the future quite clearly. Houses built with the parlor, focused not on the hearth where families once gathered to share stories and warmth, but on the box. The hearth will go cold, the stories will wither, and we shall all sit in the dim light of the neon tube, bathed in the glow of other people's lives, watching the flickering images of politicians who lie with better lighting and actors who are more beautiful than any person we have ever met in the flesh. We will be connected to everything, and we will be alone in our rooms staring into the abyss, and the abyss will be broadcasting a commercial for high-quality, long-lasting hair tonic. Is it progress? Well, that is a matter for the historians. It is certainly movement, and movement is often mistaken for progress by people who are in too much of a hurry to notice they are running in the wrong direction. We have captured the image, we have harnessed the light, and we have brought the distant near. We have conquered the limitations of space, only to find that we have shackled ourselves to the limitations of our own devices. The scientists walked away from Baird's laboratory that day, I suspect, with a mixture of awe and unease. They had seen the future, and it was a small orange vibrating head inside a wooden box. They didn't know whether to cheer or to run for the hills, and so, like the sensible men they were, they probably went to a pub, ordered a stout, and complained about the state of the weather. As for me, I shall keep my own counsel. I have lived through the invention of the telegraph, the telephone, and the phonograph, and I have found that each one brings us a little closer to one another while making us a little more distant from ourselves. The television is simply the next step in this long, strange dance. It is the box that will teach us how to watch the world burn without ever having to feel the heat. It is a wonder, a truly magnificent and terrifying wonder. And yet, if you ask me, I would much rather watch a sunset over the Mississippi than a blurry, glowing head on a screen. But then, I am an old man, and I know that the world is moving on without me, spinning its disks, flickering its lights, and dreaming of a day when no one will ever have to be alone with their own thoughts again. It is a noble goal, I suppose, if you happen to be terrified of what those thoughts might say. Chapter 4. Goddard's Liquid-Fueled Firecracker. If there is one thing that the human race is truly exceptional at, it is the pursuit of things that are clearly none of our business. We have conquered the oceans, largely by sinking ships. We have conquered the air, largely by crashing planes. And now, in this year of 1926, we have decided that the moon, that lovely distant ornament of the night sky, is a target that we have simply neglected to hit for far too long. In a frozen, desolate cabbage patch in Auburn, Massachusetts, a quiet man named Robert Goddard was busy setting the stage for this extraterrestrial mischief. Mr. Goddard was a man of the sort of single-minded intensity that usually suggests either a visionary or a candidate for the local asylum. While his neighbors were worrying about the price of hay or the impending frost, Goddard was worrying about the tyranny of gravity. He had reached the firm conclusion that the earth was a very fine place to start, but a very poor place to stay, and that the only way to escape its stubborn embrace was to build a carriage that didn't need to push against the air. He had decided upon a liquid-fueled rocket. To the layman, this sounds like a remarkably foolish way to spend a Tuesday. It involves mixing gasoline, a substance that is already quite enthusiastic about turning into fire, with liquid oxygen, a substance that is essentially the concentrated spirit of volatility. When you combine the two, you aren't so much building a vehicle as you are constructing a very sophisticated, very expensive way to turn your backyard into a cautionary tale. The day of the launch was, by all accounts, a dismal affair. The landscape was brittle with cold, the sky was a flat, uninspiring gray, and the rocket itself, a spindly, metallic thing that looked like a stovepipe that had gone on a diet, stood in the cabbage patch with an air of profound uncertainty. It did not look like a vessel that would carry man to the stars. It looked like a project that a group of mischievous boys might have cobbled together from the contents of a junkyard, provided those boys had a dangerous amount of access to industrial chemicals. There were no crowds. There was no brass band. There was only the wind whistling through the dry, neglected stalks of winter cabbage, and the quiet, nervous breathing of a man who was about to prove that all his life's work was either the beginning of the future or the end of his eyebrows. When the ignition sparked, the event lasted exactly 2.5 seconds. It is a period of time that is usually just enough to regret a poor choice of words. But for Mr. Goddard, it was an eternity of triumph. The rocket erupted with a roar that startled the local crows and sent the nearby cows into a state of existential panic. It rose, it actually rose, climbing into the thin, biting air with the grace of a startled pheasant. It reached a staggering altitude of 41 feet before the laws of physics, which are famously unsympathetic to human ambition, tapped it on the shoulder and reminded it that what goes up must eventually accept the reality of the mud. It crashed. It crashed with a wet, thumping finality that sent bits of cabbage and frozen dirt flying in every direction. It was a failure of the most spectacular, unambiguous sort. And yet, Robert Goddard stood there in the silence that followed, his face smeared with soot, his hands shaking slightly, and he knew something that the rest of the world would not catch on to for another 30 years. The moon had just been measured. It is a curious trait of the human animal that we treat failure as a personal insult from the universe. We expect our grand designs to work on the first attempt, and when they don't, we are inclined to bury the evidence and pretend we were only joking. But the scientists of the future, those fellows who will eventually be eating freeze-dried eggs on the surface of that cratered marble in the sky, will owe everything to this pathetic, muddy disaster in a Massachusetts vegetable garden. Goddard had shown that you don't need a propeller to move, and you don't need the atmosphere to give you a push. You only need to create your own chaos and direct it toward the horizon. I have often thought that if God had intended for us to travel to the moon, he would have put it closer, or perhaps provided us with a ladder. Instead, he left us to our own devices, surrounded by gasoline, liquid oxygen, and a burning, irrational desire to stand on a rock that has no air, no water, and absolutely nothing to recommend it as a vacation spot. It is the ultimate American project. We want to go there simply because it is far away and we are told we shouldn't. If you were to ask the average man in 1926 what he thought of this event, he would likely offer a blank stare. He is currently occupied with the rising cost of bread, the mystery of the radio, and the question of whether his neighbors are drinking more than they let on. He has no interest in rockets. He has no interest in liquid fuel. He is tethered to the earth by the heavy chains of rent and taxes, and the notion of escaping to the heavens is as foreign to him as the concept of a tax-free income. And yet, there is something deeply, inherently funny about the way we view this progress. We look at a rocket that flies for 2 seconds and crashes, and we call it science. We look at a man who spends his savings on Cabbage Patch pyrotechnics, and we call him a pioneer. We are a species of incurable gamblers, and we treat the entire universe as a poker game in which we are determined to hold the winning hand, even if we have to set the table on fire to get it. Goddard went back to his shop that afternoon, I imagine, to start sketching the next version. He was already planning for 100 feet, then 1,000, then a distance that would make the birds stop and reconsider their own career paths. He didn't care about the mud. He didn't care about the skeptics who would label his work a fizzle. He was a man possessed by the idea that there is no limit to how far one can go, provided one is willing to endure a little bit of failure along the way. It is a fine sentiment if you have the stomach for it. Most of us, when we hit the ground, prefer to stay there and complain about the quality of the dirt. But there are those few, those blessed, cursed, driven souls who look at the crash site, pull out a slide rule and ask, well, what did we learn about the angle of the nozzle? We are living in an age of miracles, where we can send a man's voice around the world on a wire and his face through the air on a wave. But this rocket business, this is something else entirely. This is an attempt to break the fundamental contract of our existence, which states that we are creatures of the ground. By attempting to leave the earth, we are not merely seeking adventure. We are seeking to redefine what it means to be human. And the irony, of course, is that we will likely spend all of our energy and all of our ingenuity to get to the moon, only to find that the moon is remarkably like the earth, full of rocks, dust, and a profound lack of company. And we will be left standing there in our pressurized suits, wondering why we left the Cabbage Patch in the first place. We will have conquered the heavens, and we will still be, at our core, the same creatures who worry about the frost and the price of hay. But until that day comes, I shall enjoy the spectacle of it all. I shall watch the news of these liquid-fueled firecrackers with a keen eye, waiting for the day when the fire doesn't quit, when the metal doesn't crumple, and when we finally look down at the earth from the dark, cold safety of the void. And when that happens, I hope there is someone there with a sense of humor to tell us that we've made a terrible mistake. Because if we ever reach the moon and take ourselves too seriously, then the game will truly be over. But as long as we are still crashing in cabbage patches, there is still hope for the comedy of man. Chapter 5. The Top of the World. There is a particular brand of madness that affects the human species once we have exhausted the possibilities of the flatlands and the crowded cities. It is the madness of the map-maker and the adventurer, a desperate, itchy compulsion to find the very last place on earth where one can stand, look in every direction, and truthfully say, there is nowhere else to go. This, naturally, is the North Pole. It is a point on the globe that has absolutely no physical markers to recommend it, no mountain peak, no golden statue, not even a decent place to find a glass of water. And yet, men have been throwing their lives away to find it with the same fervor that a common thief throws his away to find a purse. In this year of 1926, the great race to the top of the world entered its most theatrical phase yet, thanks to a gentleman named Richard Byrd. Mr. Byrd was a man who understood the fundamental truth of the 20th century. It does not matter so much what you actually achieve, but rather how well you tell the story of your achievement to a public that is dying to be thrilled. He was an aviator, a fellow who looked as dashing in his leather cap as a poet looks in a velvet coat. And he had decided that the North Pole would not be reached by the slow, grinding drudgery of sledges and frost-bitten feet. No, he would arrive by air, in a trimotor airplane, soaring above the ice like a mechanical eagle on a mission of national glory. When he returned to civilization, the reception was something to behold. It was a ticker-tape parade of such magnitude that the city of New York looked as though it had been gift-wrapped by a giant who had developed a sudden, violent allergy to shredded paper. People cheered until they were hoarse, women fainted with the practiced grace of silent film stars, and the newspapers hailed him as the man who had finally put a flag in the top of the world. It was a triumph of the highest order, a moment of pure, unadulterated American myth-making. And yet there is always a fly in the ointment, or in this case, a leak in the oil line. While the parades were marching and the medals were being polished, the diary of Mr. Byrd's navigator, a fellow who had spent the long, cold flight staring at the horizon rather than at the crowds, began to whisper a different tale. It seemed that somewhere in the vast, white, indifferent expanse of the Arctic, the airplane had developed a mechanical shudder. It began to drip oil, that dark, sticky nectar of the machine age, and the pilot, possessed of a sudden and entirely sensible concern for his own mortality, decided that perhaps the North Pole was not a destination worth burning up over. The diary suggested, with the quiet, devastating precision of a tax auditor, that they had turned the plane around several hundred miles early, pointed the nose back toward the comforts of base camp, and declared the mission a success from the safety of their armchairs. It is the quintessential achievement of our modern era, winning a race by having the fastest typewriter. We have reached a point where the appearance of success is functionally indistinguishable from the reality of it, provided your public relations department is sufficiently robust. Why risk a frost-bitten toe or a frozen nose in the pursuit of a desolate patch of shifting ice when you can simply fly until the coffee runs low, turn back, and print a headline that says you have conquered the Arctic? The public, bless their hopeful, gullible hearts, does not want to hear about leaking oil lines or turning back early. They want to believe that the world has been mapped, that the mysteries have been solved, and that their heroes are made of the sort of stern, unyielding steel that defies both the elements and the laws of geometry. I find this whole business deeply, hilariously instructive. We have spent centuries trying to find the North Pole, a point that is, by definition, nowhere. When the explorers of old went there, they did it with dogs and sweat and the grim certainty that they might not come home. It was a noble, foolish, and entirely honest pursuit. But now? Now we have the airplane, and with the airplane we have brought the vanity of the ballroom to the silence of the tundra. There is a certain poetry in the idea of a man flying hundreds of miles away from the target, declaring he has hit the bullseye, and coming home to a parade. It is the ultimate expression of the human ego, the ability to look at an empty horizon and insist that you have seen exactly what you claim to see. It is, perhaps, the most honest thing about us. We do not actually care about the pole. We care about the status of having been there. We care about the ticker tape. We care about the feeling of being the first, even if that first is merely a matter of being the first to lie to the newspapers. One must wonder what the ice thinks of it all. The Arctic is a vast, ancient, and utterly indifferent place. It has seen the rise and fall of empires, the coming and going of species, and the slow rhythmic dance of the glaciers, and it is entirely unimpressed by the sound of an engine or the frantic scribbling of a navigator. It is a place that does not know how to lie because it has no need to. It simply is. And yet, we humans insist on imposing our narrative upon it, carving our names into the air and claiming victory over a wilderness that doesn't even know we are there. If the truth of the flight ever leaked out, would the people care? I suspect not. They would likely defend Mr. Byrd with the same fervor they used to defend their favorite sports team or their chosen political party. They have invested in the story, they have bought the ticket, they have felt the thrill of the parade. To admit that the plane turned around would be to admit that they were being sold a bill of goods, and humanity is rarely in the mood for such self-reflection. We would much rather live in the comfort of a magnificent falsehood than in the cold, biting wind of an inconvenient truth. So, let the record show that Richard Byrd flew to the North Pole. Let the statues be built and the histories be written, and let the navigator's diary remain a footnote, a quiet, muttering ghost in the back of the library. It is a fitting conclusion for the era. We are the masters of the atmosphere, the kings of the cloud, and the architects of our own reality. We have decided that the world is ours to define, and if the map doesn't quite match the geography, well, that is simply because the mapmaker has not yet been given a big enough parade. As for me, I find I have developed a sudden, deep affection for the navigator. He is the only one in the entire comedy who had the courage to look at the truth and write it down. He understood that while you can fool the world, you cannot fool your own notebook. But even he, I imagine, stood on the deck of the ship as they sailed home, watching the ice drift by, and realized that in the eyes of the world it was already too late to be right. He was trapped in the narrative just like the rest of us. We are all, in our own way, flying toward a target we have no intention of hitting, hoping that if we just keep the engine running and the story straight, no one will notice that we turned back before the ice began to thin. It is a grand, dizzying, and utterly human way to travel, and I, for one, would not have it any other way. It is, after all, a much better story than the one where the oil line leaks and the pilot decides to go home for dinner. Chapter 6. Gertrude Ederle, Shims the Moat. If you were to consult the collective wisdom of the British Admiralty in the year 1926, you would be told that the English Channel is a moat of historical significance, a watery fortress that has successfully discouraged the unwanted attention of emperors, conquerors, and overambitious continental neighbors for a very long time. It is a temperamental, cold, and treacherous strip of salt water that demands a great deal of respect, and traditionally, it has expected that respect to be delivered in the form of a sturdy wooden ship with plenty of cannon ports. It is not, by any stretch of the imagination, a place for a young lady from Manhattan to spend a pleasant afternoon of exercise. And yet, there was Gertrude Ederle. Miss Ederle, a 20-year-old butcher's daughter from New York, possessed a set of shoulders that would have made a blacksmith envious, and a stubborn streak that was, by all accounts, wide enough to bridge the Atlantic itself. While the men of the world were busy trying to cross the ocean in airplanes that were mostly held together by wire and wishful thinking, and while the explorers were busy trying to convince us that they had reached the North Pole by flying in circles over the ice, Miss Ederle decided to do something far more radical. She decided to swim. Now, swimming the English Channel is an endeavor that combines the discomfort of a long bath with the occupational hazards of an Arctic expedition. The water is not merely cold. It is the sort of cold that has a personal grudge against human anatomy. It is filled with currents that change their minds as often as a politician during an election year. And it is populated by jellyfish that have no sense of decorum and a great deal of stinging enthusiasm. When Gertrude arrived on the coast, the local experts, a group of men whose primary expertise seemed to be in the field of standing on the shore and looking skeptical, informed her that she would certainly fail. Swimming the Channel, they explained with the weary patience of those who have seen many foolish youngsters drown, is a man's job. It requires the raw, unrefined strength of a gale-force wind, the endurance of an ox, and a complete lack of nervous system. A girl, they whispered behind their mustaches, would be lucky to make it a mile before the cold turned her limbs to stone. Gertrude did not argue. She did not draft a press release. She did not ask for a committee to review the physics of her buoyancy. She simply went to a local supply shop, purchased a staggering quantity of lard, and proceeded to coat herself from the top of her head to the soles of her feet in a thick, shimmering layer of grease. It is a sight that would have stunned the sensibilities of the Victorian era. A young lady, covered in butcher's fat, preparing to plunge into the gray, churning maw of the sea, while the world looked on in collective bewilderment. There is something profoundly, beautifully absurd about the spectacle. It is the ultimate rejection of the refined, the proper, and the delicate. It is a primal, greasy, glorious act of defiance. She dove in, and then she kept going. The British Coast Guard, those noble sentinels of the moat, stood on their decks and watched through their spyglasses, waiting for the inevitable moment when the girl would realize her mistake, wave for a boat, and accept a blanket and a hot cup of tea. They waited for an hour. Then they waited for 5. Then they waited for 10. As the sun began to sink below the horizon and the stars began to poke their cold, indifferent heads through the clouds, the Coast Guard began to look increasingly uncomfortable. Miss Ederle was not sinking. She was not shivering. She was moving with a rhythmic, machine-like persistence that seemed to suggest she had no intention of ever stopping. Her arms cut through the water like pistons, and her legs churned beneath the surface like the propellers of a steamship. She wasn't just swimming. She was consuming the geography. The men in the boats, who had been fully prepared to act as witnesses to a failure, were instead forced to act as witnesses to a humiliation. It turned out that their historical moat, their strategic barrier, their pride and joy, could be crossed by a girl from Manhattan in less time than it took for their own Navy to organize a proper rowing formation. It was a scandal. It was an outrage. It was, more than anything else, a source of profound, quiet laughter for anyone with a sense of perspective. She didn't just cross the channel. She shattered the record. She beat the men's time by over 2 hours, a detail that surely caused a great deal of indigestion in the gentlemen's clubs of London that evening. When she finally stumbled onto the sand of the English coast, exhausted, shaking, and smelling faintly of the butcher shop, the world did not know how to react. They wanted to applaud, but they were also a bit worried about what it meant for the established order of things. If a butcher's daughter can cross the channel, what, pray tell, is left for the rest of us to be proud of? The answer, of course, is nothing, and that is the brilliance of it. Gertrude Ederle had proven that the barriers we build, the moats, the borders, the limitations we place upon our children and our neighbors are only as strong as our collective willingness to believe they are impassable. She had turned a strategic military landmark into a personal achievement, and in doing so, she had stripped the English Channel of its mystery. It was no longer a moat. It was a swimming pool, a very cold, very wet, very long swimming pool, but a pool nonetheless. There is a lesson here, though I suspect the world is too busy looking for the next record breaker to bother with the philosophy. The lesson is that the world is far more navigable than we give it credit for, provided you are willing to get a little bit greasy, and you have the sense not to listen to the men who stand on the shore telling you that it can't be done. The world is full of people who are experts on why things are impossible. They are the same people who are always the most surprised when someone ignores them. I imagine Miss Ederle returned to New York with a pile of medals and a look of quiet, amused exhaustion. She had seen the other side of the water, and she had done it on her own terms. She had conquered the channel, and she had done it without a single cannon or a single imperial decree. She had simply used her own 2 arms and a bit of determination, and that, in the grand, chaotic, and often ridiculous story of humanity, is a victory that deserves to be remembered long after the records have been broken by the next eager youngster with a tub of lard. It was, in truth, the most sensible thing anyone had done all year. While the rest of the world was busy dreaming of machines, she was busy relying on the only machine that really matters, the human spirit. And it turns out that machine is a good deal more buoyant than the experts ever realized. So here is to the butcher's daughter, the girl who shimmed the moat, and the enduring, hilarious, and utterly stubborn truth that sometimes the best way to cross a barrier is to dive in, grease yourself up, and simply refuse to sink. It is a lesson I intend to keep in mind, although I think I shall stick to the ferry for the foreseeable future. I have never been fond of the cold, and I am quite certain I lack the requisite shoulders for the job. Chapter 7. The Corpse That Broke the Windows. In the grand, gaudy theater of human existence, there is no performance quite as popular as the one that takes place after the curtain has fallen, and the lead actor has shuffled off into the wings for the final time. We are a species that finds the ending of a life to be a terribly inconvenient truth, and so, whenever a celebrity decides to abandon the stage, we engage in a collective, performative hysteria that serves to remind everyone involved that, yes, we are very much alive, and we find the whole business of mortality to be an exceptionally poor taste. But never, in the long, storied history of funeral follies, was there an exit quite as spectacular as that of Rudolph Valentino. Mr. Valentino, a man who possessed the kind of dark, brooding magnetism that made women swoon with the regularity of a malfunctioning metronome, had the misfortune of dying at the tender age of 31. He was the great lover of the silent screen, a man who could convey more passion with a single, lingering gaze than most men can achieve in a lifetime of poetry. He didn't just act in movies, he inhabited the collective fantasies of a nation that was, quite frankly, starved for a bit of romantic color in their black and white lives. When his heart gave out in August, the reaction was not merely one of grief. It was an eruption of mass psychosis. The news tore through the wires with the velocity of a lightning bolt, and by the time it reached the public, it had already metastasized into something resembling a religious crusade. Thousands of people, mostly women who had spent their Saturday afternoons nursing a private, flickering crush on the man in the fedora, descended upon the New York funeral home with the single-mindedness of a locust swarm. They didn't just want to mourn. They wanted to participate. They wanted to witness the final transformation of the man who had starred in their most elaborate daydreams. They formed lines that stretched for blocks, a winding serpentine procession of despair that moved with the slow, agonizing rhythm of a funeral march. And when the doors of the funeral home were locked, the logic of the mourners, which had already been stretched thin by their infatuation, snapped completely. They broke the windows. It is a detail that I find endlessly fascinating. The act of shattering glass in the name of a man who could no longer blink, let alone admire their devotion. People were trampled, clothes were torn, and the air was thick with a high, keening wail of collective heartbreak. It was a riot of romance. It was a skirmish over a silhouette. And for those of us watching from the sidelines, it provided a chilling, if somewhat humorous, glimpse into the fragility of the modern heart. The American husbands, poor, bewildered souls, stood on the edges of this chaos and watched their wives weep over a man who had never existed outside of a projector's beam. They were witnessing a phenomenon they could not hope to compete with. Their own spouses were in love with an illusion, a flickering shade of light that had been captured on celluloid and sold to the masses for a nickel. You cannot buy a bouquet for an illusion. You cannot compete with a ghost. And so the husbands merely looked on, baffled, perhaps a bit relieved that the man in question was no longer available to steal their thunder, but deeply troubled by the realization that their wives' affections were currently occupied by a memory that had no pulse. The funeral itself was a farce of biblical proportions. There were floral arrangements that cost more than a small farm, and wreaths that arrived from admirers who had never met the man but felt entitled to his legacy nonetheless. It was a master class in the commerce of grief. The industry of the funeral had realized that when a star goes out, there is a vacuum left behind, and if you can provide the right sort of atmosphere, the public will pay handsomely for the privilege of standing in the presence of that absence. I have often pondered the nature of this star business. We create these icons, these larger-than-life figures who are meant to embody our highest hopes and our most secret desires, and then we are genuinely shocked when they prove to be mortal. We hold them to a standard of perfection that no human being could ever hope to meet. And when they inevitably fail, whether by scandal, aging, or the simple, brutal finality of death, we punish them with our hysteria. We make their deaths into a public spectacle, as if by weeping loudly enough we can force them to rise, brush off their tuxedos, and get back to the business of entertaining us. The tragedy of the situation, if one can call it that, is that Valentino didn't even have to say a word to command this level of devotion. His power lay in his silence. He was a blank screen upon which millions of people could project their own longings. He was the perfect, malleable fantasy, and because he was silent, he could never contradict them. He could never say a foolish thing in a real voice. He could never reveal a petty habit. He could never be anything other than the idealized version of what his audience needed him to be. But the moment he died, the illusion became dangerous. It became a focus for all the anxieties of a generation that was moving too fast, a generation that was trying to find its footing in a world that was suddenly flooded with radios, airplanes, and the unsettling realization that the old certainties were melting away. When the windows of the funeral home shattered, they weren't just breaking glass. They were attempting to break through the veil of their own mortality. They were trying to get closer to the thing that had promised them a better, more romantic, more exciting world. I imagine the spirit of Mr. Valentino, if it exists, would have been highly amused by the whole affair. To have caused such a commotion while doing absolutely nothing at all. To have mobilized thousands of people to riot in your name while you were peacefully occupying a mahogany box is the ultimate triumph of the performer. It is the final, grand gesture of a man who understood the value of a dramatic entrance and an even more dramatic exit. In the end, of course, the riot subsided. The glass was replaced. The streets were swept clean of the debris of mourning, and the public found a new star to obsess over. That is the way of the world. We are quick to elevate and even quicker to forget. We leave our flowers at the grave, we dry our eyes, and we go back to the theaters to find a new dream, a new face, a new voice to fill the emptiness of our Saturday afternoons. It is a comedy of errors, played out on a global scale. We invest our emotions in shadows, and we are surprised when they cannot hold our weight. We build monuments to the fleeting, and we are left empty-handed when the moment passes. But that is the human condition, is it not? We are all searching for a bit of light in the darkness, and if we occasionally mistake a flickering bulb in a funeral home for a star, well, that is only to be expected. I shall remember Valentino not for the riots, but for the quiet, subtle power he had to make us believe in something other than the mundane reality of our own lives. He was, in his own way, a magician who had successfully conjured a dream that lasted just long enough to make the waking world feel a little bit more tolerable. And if he had to break a few windows on his way out, I suppose we should forgive him. It was, after all, the most exciting thing that had happened in New York in a very long time, and everyone, even the husbands in their own quiet way, appreciated the show. As for the rest of us, we shall continue to watch the screens, and we shall continue to dream. We know the ending, of course. We know that the lights will eventually go dark, and that the illusion will fade. But as long as there is a bit of popcorn in our hands and a bit of hope in our hearts, we will stay in our seats until the very last frame. It is the best deal we are ever likely to get. Chapter 8. Agatha Christie's Unwritten Plot. There is no creature on this earth quite so dangerous as a woman who has been pushed to the edge by the mundane cruelties of a husband, particularly when that woman happens to possess a mind like a razor-sharp steel trap and a penchant for elaborate fictionalized vengeance. Mrs. Agatha Christie, a lady whose name is synonymous with the art of the well-constructed puzzle, found herself in the closing months of 1926 in the sort of predicament that would make a less capable person reach for the smelling salts or a quiet lawyer. Her husband, a man whose imagination apparently suffered from a chronic lack of inspiration, had requested a divorce, seemingly unaware that he was attempting to break a contract with a woman who had built a career on the meticulous destruction of characters who crossed her. The lady did not scream. She did not throw porcelain at the wall. She did not hire a solicitor to haggle over the division of the silver. Instead, she did what any self-respecting mystery writer would do. She disappeared. It was a vanishing act of such professional grade that it rendered the entirety of the British police force, a collection of men who prided themselves on their ability to locate a missing pair of socks, entirely incompetent. For 11 days, the United Kingdom was turned into an enormous, frantic stage for a drama that no one quite understood. They deployed airplanes, which buzzed over the countryside like frustrated hornets. They brought in bloodhounds, who spent a great deal of time sniffing at nothing in particular with an air of profound confusion. And they called upon thousands of volunteers to comb the woods, the heaths, and the damp, depressing alleys of the nation. It was a masterpiece of misdirection. The public, fueled by a healthy diet of tabloid sensation and the genuine collective anxiety of a society that likes its mysteries contained within the covers of a book, went into a frenzy. Was she abducted? Was she the victim of a dastardly crime? Was she lying at the bottom of a pond, staring up at the clouds with the glazed, accusing eyes of a woman who had figured out the culprit before the first chapter was finished? The husband, meanwhile, stood in the center of the storm, looking appropriately distraught and perhaps just a bit nervous. He was the prime suspect in a mystery that he hadn't even written, a man caught in the gears of a plot that was being constructed by his wife without his input, his permission, or even his knowledge. It is a terrifying thing to be the protagonist of a story written by Agatha Christie, especially when you have given her a motive, and then just as the hysteria reached a fever pitch, just as the newspapers were beginning to print the obituaries and the public was preparing to canonize the poor, vanished authoress, the solution to the mystery was revealed. She was found, calm and collected, staying at a spa hotel in Harrogate. And what was the name she was using to check in? Why, the very name of the woman her husband had been pining for. It was a slap in the face so elegant, so precise, and so thoroughly devastating that I imagine it must have been audible from one end of the empire to the other. She hadn't been kidnapped. She hadn't been murdered. She had simply gone on a holiday to watch her husband squirm. It was the only mystery she ever wrote where the solution was purely, unadulteratedly spite, and it was, without question, her finest work. The police were, to put it mildly, embarrassed. They had spent nearly 2 weeks turning the country upside down, chasing shadows and wasting the taxpayers' time, all while the woman they were looking for was enjoying the baths and the mineral water of a posh resort. The husband was left to explain to the world how he had managed to make his wife disappear simply by being a cad, and the public was left with the dawning, uncomfortable realization that they had been played for fools by a woman who could write circles around them in her sleep. I have often wondered if she sat there in that hotel sipping her tea and reading the papers, chuckling as she watched the search parties flail about like headless chickens. It must have been a sublime feeling to be the most sought-after woman in the world while sitting in a bathrobe, reading a book, and waiting for the dust to settle. It was a triumph of the ego, a victory of the intellect over the blundering, heavy-handed efforts of the state. But what strikes me most about this episode is the sheer, beautiful comedy of the intent. We live in a world where we are taught to handle our disappointments with grace, to swallow our pride, and to move on with the stiff upper lip fortitude that is expected of civilized folk. We are meant to be predictable. We are meant to be sad or angry or resigned. We are not meant to be theatrical. We are not meant to turn our personal lives into a grand sweeping production that forces the entire nation to participate in our own private retribution. Mrs. Christie had demonstrated that the most effective way to handle a crisis is to make everyone else look like a buffoon. She had turned the investigative apparatus of the empire into a punchline. She had shown that if you are clever enough, you don't need to fight. You simply need to remove yourself from the board and watch the pieces collapse on their own. Of course, the scandal died down. The husband got his divorce, the papers moved on to the next tragedy, and Agatha returned to her desk to write about poisoned tea and locked rooms. But the legend remained. It was the story of the woman who went missing to find herself, or perhaps to lose her husband. It remains a cautionary tale for all men who think they can trifles with the heart of a storyteller. If you cross a woman who writes, you are not just crossing a person, you're crossing an architect of fates. You're handing her the ink, the paper, and the motive, and you should not be surprised when the story ends with you looking like a very confused, very exposed, and very foolish man. The irony, of course, is that she became even more famous for her disappearance than for many of her books. She had lived a mystery. She had created a narrative that was so compelling, so layered, and so inherently funny that even the most hardened detective would have to admit he'd been bested. And yet, she never wrote about it. She never tried to monetize the event, never sold the rights to a movie, and never bothered to explain her motives to the press. She simply let it be. She had made her point, she had enjoyed her spa, and she had moved on to the next case. It is a rare thing to possess that kind of self-containment. Most of us, if we had managed to pull off such a stunt, would be shouting it from the rooftops, writing our memoirs, and trying to win a prize for our cleverness. But she was a master of the craft. She knew that the best mystery is the one where the author remains anonymous, standing behind the curtain, enjoying the show. I find myself thinking of her often when I look at the modern world, a place where everyone is constantly broadcasting their grievances, their plans, and their petty triumphs on the radio or in the journals. We have lost the ability to be silent, to be mysterious, to hold our cards close to our chest and wait for the perfect moment to reveal the hand. We have lost the ability to make our lives into an art form. But then, perhaps That is why we read her books. We read them because we are all looking for a bit of control in a world that is spinning out of our hands. We read them because we want to see the culprit caught, the mystery solved, and the order restored. And perhaps, in our heart of hearts, we are all just a little bit like the woman who checked into that hotel in Harrogate under a false name, waiting for the world to notice we were gone, and secretly hoping that we would be the ones to write the ending. It is a wonderful, whimsical, and thoroughly satisfying story. If I were a younger man, I might be tempted to try it myself, though I suspect the police would be much less interested in searching for a writer of my particular temperament. They would likely just leave me to my own devices, which I suppose would be the greatest insult of all. But for Mrs. Christie, it was a triumph, a legend, and a lesson to us all. If you want to teach a man a lesson, don't argue with him. Just vanish. He will do all the work for you, and by the time you come back, he will have already written the conclusion where he is the one who lost everything. It is, truly, the only way to play the game. Chapter 9. The Last Escape of Harry Houdini. It is a singular irony of our existence that the man who spent his entire life teaching us that walls are merely suggestions, that locks are just puzzles, and that gravity is an opinion one can occasionally disagree with, should have been undone by a common garden variety punch to the midsection. Harry Houdini, the man who had walked through walls, escaped from iron coffins, and emerged from the icy, swirling depths of frozen rivers with the composure of a man returning from a particularly refreshing nap, was finally brought to heel not by a master of the dark arts or a revolutionary new restraint, but by a college student who simply wanted to see if the magician's famous abdominal muscles were as impenetrable as the newspapers claimed. It happened in Montreal, on Halloween of all days, a date that I suspect Mr. Houdini would have found entirely too on the nose for his own obituary. He was reclining in his dressing room, perhaps daydreaming of his next great defiance of the natural order, when a young fellow, a student of the sort who believes that the world is a laboratory and every man is a specimen, asked if it were true that he could withstand any blow to the stomach. Houdini, who was a man of his word and possessed a vanity that matched his skill, nodded and invited the fellow to have at it. Now, a man of Houdini's experience knows that one does not simply invite a stranger to strike one in the gut without a bit of preparation. One must brace, one must tighten, and one must anticipate the impact. But our magician was caught unawares. Before he could draw a breath or firm up his resolve, the student delivered a flurry of blows, a sudden, unchoreographed assault that left the great escape artist doubled over in a state of genuine physiological distress. It was the only time in his life, I suspect, that he was truly trapped. He couldn't escape the pain. He couldn't vanish from the room. He couldn't wiggle his way out of the consequences of a simple, clumsy, and entirely unnecessary bit of curiosity. It is a comedy of the darkest sort, is it not? We look at the masters of the world, the kings, the conquerors, the great thinkers, and we imagine them to be made of some higher, more durable substance than the rest of us. We imagine they live in a realm where the small, petty accidents of life cannot reach them. And then a student with a closed fist and a lack of manners proves that they are, at their core, just as fragile as a china teacup dropped on a hardwood floor. Houdini spent his remaining days in a state of worsening agony, his body failing him in a way that no amount of sleight of hand could rectify. He was a man who had made a profession out of cheating death, of performing a delicate rhythmic dance with the reaper, only to find that when the end finally came, it wasn't a grand dramatic curtain call. It wasn't a disappearance into a cloud of smoke or a daring dive from a skyscraper. It was just a lingering quiet exit, a slow fade to black that robbed him of his mystery. The world, when it heard the news, was genuinely, profoundly stunned. We had all come to believe in his immortality. He was the man who couldn't be held, the man who couldn't be contained, and to see him felled by a punch, and a punch from an amateur at that, was a blow to the national psyche. We felt betrayed by the laws of physics. We demanded that he find a way out of his own deathbed. We expected him to sit up, wink at the doctors, and ask for a deck of cards. But he didn't. He succumbed to the weight of his own mortality, and for the first time in his life, the great escape artist failed to reappear for the encore. It brings to mind the fundamental, hilarious futility of our struggle against the inevitable. We spend our lives building our own cages, our societal expectations, our professional reputations, our anxieties about the future, and we treat them as if they are iron chains and concrete walls. We spend our time trying to pick the locks on our own lives, trying to find a way to be free, to be extraordinary, to be something other than the creatures of habit and biology that we actually are. And Houdini, bless his restless soul, was the ultimate champion of this human impulse. He was our surrogate. He was the proof that the bars don't have to hold us. And yet, in the end, the bars always hold. The cage is always stronger. The wall eventually proves to be solid. There is a lesson here, if one has the stomach to read it. We are all living in a state of temporary suspension. We are all performing our little tricks, our little acts of defiance against the gravity of our circumstances, hoping that as long as we keep moving, as long as we keep the audience entertained, we can put off the final act. But the final act is written for us. Before we even take the stage, it is a one-man show, and the lights always go out at the end, regardless of how much applause we have garnered or how many handcuffs we have managed to slip. I find myself thinking of the student, that young man who has gone down in history as the fellow who killed Houdini. What a burden to carry! To be known not for your own achievements, not for your own wit or wisdom, but for a split second of poor judgment that changed the course of a legend. I hope he had the sense to keep his mouth shut, to avoid the temptation of the lecture circuit, and to live a life of quiet, unremarkable obscurity. It is the only way to recover from such a thing. To be the man who broke the window in Agatha Christie's story is a triumph. To be the man who punched Houdini is a tragedy. Houdini's death was the end of an era, though we didn't quite know it at the time. It was the moment we lost our faith in the impossible. We were entering an age where the impossible would be replaced by the technical, where we would no longer need magicians because we would have science and radios and airplanes and the slow, grinding machinery of the modern world to explain away the wonders that once made us gasp. We were trading our awe for information, our mystery for data. And perhaps that is why his death felt so hollow. We weren't just losing a man. We were losing the sensation of being surprised. I would have liked to have known him, I think. I would have liked to sit down with him, share a cigar, and ask him if he ever truly believed in the tricks, or if he was just as amused by the audience as I am. Did he ever look at a locked door and think, I wonder what's on the other side? Or did he only ever see it as a mechanical failure waiting to happen? There is a cold, clinical brilliance to his work that I admire, a sense that he had stripped the world of its pretensions and found that it was all just nuts, bolts, and the gullibility of the crowd. But he is gone now, buried in the silence that he could never quite escape. He left us with a world that is a little bit less magical, a little bit more predictable, and a whole lot more dangerous, because now we know that even the ones who say they can do anything are just as susceptible to a stray punch as the rest of us. So let us remember him not for how he died, but for the glorious, arrogant, and thoroughly wonderful way he lived. Let us remember him as the man who dared to tell us that we didn't have to be prisoners of our own lives, even if, in the end, he was the one who couldn't find the key. It is a good story, a sad story, and a quintessentially human story. And if you ask me, that is the greatest trick of all. To live a life so improbable, so impossible, and so utterly captivating that even death has to wait in the wings until the final curtain call. Houdini may have failed his final escape, but he gave the rest of us a damn good show while it lasted. Chapter 10, Route 66, The Concrete Ribbon. There is a particular ambition that haunts the American character, a dream so vast and so stubborn that it could only have been born in a land where the horizon is a suggestion rather than a border. We have spent our history trying to connect one end of the continent to the other, dragging our possessions, our grudges, and our peculiar habits across the wilderness, hoping that if we just kept moving, we might eventually find a place where we didn't have to explain ourselves. In 1926, the federal government decided to formalize this restlessness by establishing the U.S. highway system. And at the crown of this network was a ribbon of concrete and asphalt that would stretch from the busy, windy shores of Chicago to the sun-drenched, palm-shaded Pacific at Santa Monica, Route 66. They called it the Main Street of America, which is a charming bit of branding for a road that, in many places, was little more than a suggestion of a path through a desert designed specifically to punish the hubris of the internal combustion engine. It was the great, romantic, and utterly catastrophic dream of the automobile age. We had finally paved a path through the wilderness, not because we had any particular business being in the middle of the Arizona scrub, but because we had mastered the art of the motor car, and we were quite simply desperate for a place to go. The logic of the thing was unimpeachable. If you own a car, you must drive. If you drive, you must have a road. If you have a road, you must have a destination. And if you have a destination, you must have a reason to stop, preferably a reason that involves the purchase of a cold soda, a bag of salted nuts, or a postcard featuring a sunset that was undoubtedly touched up by a man in a basement with a set of watercolors. I have watched the early travelers on this new shining ribbon, and I must say, it is a spectacle that would bring a tear to the eye of a stoic. Families pile into their Model Ts and their Chevrolets, packing enough luggage to survive a siege, and they set off with the optimism of pioneers and the mechanical preparedness of a group of tourists attempting to climb the Alps in patent leather shoes. They are embarking on the modern joy of the motoring vacation, a noble pursuit that invariably involves the exhilarating experience of a flat tire in the middle of a landscape that is roughly 99% sand, heat, and judgmental lizards. There is a unique kind of intimacy that develops between a man and his vehicle when they are stranded 300 miles from the nearest town. It is a relationship forged in the crucible of a broken radiator hose and the deepening realization that one's mechanical skills are inversely proportional to one's confidence. I have seen patriarchs, men who would normally command the respect of their subordinates and the obedience of their children, reduced to standing by the side of the road with a wrench in their hand, offering a prayer to the God of rubber and steel, while their wives look on with the quiet, devastating patience of a saint. The road itself is a wonder, a sprawling, looping, serpentine thing that mocks the very idea of a straight line. It wiggles through the mountains, it cuts through the plains, and it seems to take a particular delight in leading the unsuspecting traveler into the most desolate, picturesque stretches of the wasteland. But that is the point of it, isn't it? The destination doesn't really matter. It's the experience of being on the road that counts. It's the feeling of freedom, the sensation of moving at the staggering, terrifying speed of 35 miles per hour, and the glorious knowledge that if you keep moving, you are, for all intents and purposes, a citizen of nowhere. It is a grand, chaotic, and thoroughly American invention. We have built a monument to the fleeting, a testament to the fact that we are a people who would rather be moving than arriving. We have taken the silence of the desert and filled it with the hum of the engine and the scent of gasoline. We have put up signs, hundreds, thousands of signs, shouting at us to eat at Joe's, to sleep at Pete's, and to see the world's largest ball of twine, as if the desert itself were not a sufficient attraction for the curious mind. I often think about those families, cramped into their upholstery, breathing in the dust, and arguing about which turn they missed 3 hours ago. They are living a life that is stripped of the comforts of home, a life that is focused entirely on the struggle of the next mile. And yet, there is something remarkably noble about it. They are participants in the great, unfolding drama of the 20th century. They are the explorers of the asphalt, the scouts of the gas station, the pioneers of the picnic. They are proving, one blowout at a time, that there is no patch of earth too desolate, no heat too intense, and no engine too temperamental to be conquered by the sheer unyielding force of human curiosity. And what of the road itself? It is a living, breathing thing. It grows and shifts. It crumbles and is repaired, and it bears the marks of the millions of tires that have raced across its surface. It is the repository of our stories, the arguments, the songs, the dreams, and the quiet, desperate realizations that happen in the dim light of the dashboard after midnight. It is a record of our passage, a testament to the fact that we were here, that we were going somewhere, and that we weren't about to let a little thing like a desert or a broken axle stop us. There is, of course, a darker side to this romance. We are paving over the history of the land, burying the quiet, slow rhythms of the past under a layer of crushed rock and tar. We are replacing the local flavor with the standardized, the familiar, and the comfortable. We are making the world smaller, more uniform, and more predictable. And I cannot help but feel a pang of regret for the things we are losing in our rush to make the journey easier. We are trading the adventure of the unknown for the convenience of the service station, and I am not entirely sure that we are getting the better end of the deal. But who am I to complain? I am, after all, a man who has always preferred the sound of a steamboat's whistle to the roar of a motor, and I have never been one for the constraints of a highway. But I recognize the spirit of the thing. I see the joy in the eyes of the child looking out the window at a cactus for the first time, and I see the relief in the face of the father when he finally manages to patch that tire and get the engine to sputter back to life. There is a pride in that, a sense of having survived the machine and the wilderness, and that is a victory worth celebrating. Route 66 is more than just a road. It is an idea. It is the belief that there is always something better around the next bend, that the journey itself is the prize, and that no matter how tired you are, or how hungry you get, or how many times your radiator decides to vent its spleen on the side of the road, you are part of a grand, moving tapestry. You are one of the millions of souls who have dared to believe that the world is yours to traverse, provided you have the gas, the time, and a very sturdy set of tires. So, let the road continue to stretch its long concrete fingers across the landscape. Let the families continue to pile into their cars and chase the sunset. Let the signs continue to promise us the impossible for the price of a hamburger. It is a chaotic, messy, and thoroughly imperfect world we have built for ourselves, but it is our world, and we have paved it with our dreams, our failures, and our unrelenting, stubborn refusal to stay put. And if you happen to find yourself out there somewhere between Chicago and the Pacific, and you see a man standing by the side of the road with a wrench in his hand and a look of profound existential confusion on his face, do me a favor. Pull over, offer him a bit of advice, and tell him that he is doing just fine. He is, after all, only doing what the rest of us are doing, trying to get to the next town without running out of gas. It is the American way, and for all its flaws, it is, in its own peculiar, dusty, gasoline-scented way, a life worth living. Chapter 11. The Savoy Ballroom and the Lindy Hop. In the bustling, energetic heart of Harlem, there exists a cathedral of a different sort. It is not built of stone or stained glass, nor is it presided over by men in robes who speak in hushed, reverent tones about the mysteries of the beyond. No, this temple is built of polished maple floorboards, and its high priest is a man with a baton and a sense of rhythm that could make a statue tap its toes. It is the Savoy Ballroom, a place so expansive that it occupies a full city block, and so vibrant that it serves as the beating, percussive pulse of the entire neighborhood. In this year of 1926, the Savoy has opened its doors, and it has done so with a radical, audacious proposition: that the rhythm of the music is the only language that matters, and that the color line, that tedious, artificial, and utterly exhausting barrier that keeps the rest of the country in a state of perpetual, miserable segregation, should be left at the coat check along with one's hat and umbrella. It is, to my knowledge, one of the few places in America where a man of one complexion and a woman of another can spin across the floor in a flurry of movement and music without the world coming to an end. It is a scandalous, joyful, and entirely necessary rebellion. The atmosphere inside the Savoy is not so much a room as it is a localized weather system of sound. You have two competing big bands, each perched on its own stage like rival kings in a war for the soul of the audience, and they trade melodies and riffs with the ferocity of artillery fire. It is a glorious, organized chaos. One band finishes a chorus, and the other immediately picks up the baton, ratcheting up the tempo until the very air in the room seems to vibrate with the urgency of the brass. And then there are the dancers. To witness the patrons of the Savoy is to witness a species that has recently decided that walking is a vastly inferior form of locomotion. They are not merely dancing, they are engaged in a form of athletic, exuberant, and highly imaginative geometry. They have invented a dance they call the Lindy Hop, a name that I am told is a nod to that young fellow who is currently staring at maps of the Atlantic and dreaming of a flight to Paris. It is a dance that defies the laws of comfort, decorum, and common sense. It involves tossing your partner through the air with a casualness that suggests you have absolutely no interest in whether they land on their feet or on their head, and then catching them, spinning them, and pulling them back into the rhythm without missing a single beat. It is, in essence, the art of throwing a sack of loose laundry into a cyclone and expecting it to emerge in a perfectly matched set. I sat in the balcony for a few hours, watching the spectacle with a mixture of awe and genuine physical fatigue. There were fellows in zoot suits who moved with the fluid, dangerous grace of a jungle cat, and women in flapper dresses that shimmered like captured moonlight as they swung through the air. They were spinning, dipping, and bouncing, and they seemed entirely untroubled by the fact that they were working harder than a crew of dock workers on a double shift. It is a profound mystery to me, this human compulsion to move in time to a series of noises. We have no biological need for it. We do not need to swing our partners to the ceiling to ensure the survival of our species. And yet, there is something deeply, undeniably human about it. It is an expression of joy that is too large for the body, a kinetic release that is more honest than any speech ever delivered from a pulpit. When the music hits that sweet syncopated spot, that moment when the drummer and the bassist decide to agree on a direction, the entire room moves as a single living organism. The divisions of class, the labels of society, the petty grievances of the day, they all evaporate in the heat of the ballroom. There is a lesson here if the politicians would only bother to come down and learn it. The Lindy Hop is a masterpiece of cooperation. You cannot toss a person through the air and expect them to remain in one piece if you do not have a mutual unspoken agreement about where they are going and how they are going to get back. It is a dance of total, absolute trust. You have to believe that when you let go, your partner will be there to catch you. And in the Savoy, on a night when the band is cooking and the floor is slick with the sweat of 1,000 people, that trust is absolute. It is a beautiful, fleeting, and fragile thing. But while the music lasts, it is the most real thing in the world. Of course, the rest of the country looks upon this with a mixture of fascination and horror. There are those who see a room full of people dancing without regard for the color of their skin and see a catastrophe waiting to happen. They cling to their prejudices with the same desperate, shivering intensity that a drowning man clings to a rock, terrified that if they let go, they might be forced to recognize their own irrelevance. They see the Lindy Hop, and they see a threat to the order of things, and they are right. It is a threat. It is a threat to the idea that we are fundamentally different, that we are meant to be kept apart, and that we are incapable of finding common ground. The Savoy is a beacon of exactly what the rest of the country is not, and that is why it is so dangerous. It shows that unity is not a matter of laws or decrees, but a matter of rhythm, a matter of finding a beat that we can all agree on and then moving together until the world stops spinning. I recall a fellow sitting near me, a man whose age was a subject of considerable debate, but whose feet were clearly in the prime of youth. He told me that in the Savoy, the only hierarchy is the one established by the skill of your feet. If you can move, you are royalty. If you have the rhythm, you are a master of the universe. It is a meritocracy of the feet, a society where you are judged only by the grace of your swing and the timing of your catch. It is, perhaps, a bit romantic. I am sure there are arguments and jealousy and the same petty human dramas that take place everywhere else. But for the duration of a song, those things don't matter. The music is the authority, and the floor is the judge. I left the ballroom as the sun was beginning to threaten the horizon, feeling as though I had witnessed a glimpse of a future that the world was not yet ready to inhabit. It was a future where we didn't worry so much about who we were and instead focused on how we could move together. It was a world of music and motion, and the sudden, breathless realization that we are all much lighter, much more graceful, and much more capable of flight than we ever dared to imagine. If I were a younger man, I might have tried to learn the steps. I might have tried to get out on that floor and risk a toss or two, but I suspect I would have only succeeded in making a spectacle of myself, ending up in a heap on the maple boards, while the band laughed and the dancers swirled around my prone, uncoordinated form. No, I shall leave the flying to the youngsters and the dreamers. I am content to watch, to tap my cane in time to the beat, and to marvel at the fact that in the middle of a world that is so deeply, stubbornly divided, there is at least one place where we can all agree on the rhythm. The Savoy is a miracle of the modern age, a testament to the fact that we are not the prisoners of our history, but the authors of our own motion. And as long as there is music, and as long as there is a floor big enough to accommodate the dreamers, I suspect there will always be a place for the Lindy Hop. It is a silly, frantic, and entirely magnificent way to spend a life, and I find I have a great deal of respect for anyone who is willing to get out there, take a partner by the hand, and launch themselves into the unknown, trusting that when they land, they will land together. It is the best we can hope for, and in truth, it is quite enough. Chapter 12. Winnie-the-Pooh and the Commerce of Comfort. In the year of 1926, a man named A. Milne, who had previously occupied his time with the serious, grown-up business of writing plays that were intended to be discussed in drawing rooms over sherry, decided to commit a most delightful act of treason against the sensibilities of his peers. He published a book about a bear of very little brain, a stuffed creature with a penchant for honey and a habit of getting his head stuck in jars that were, quite frankly, too small for his ambitions. It was a book about a forest, a group of eccentric anthropomorphic companions, and the profound slow-motion philosophy of doing absolutely nothing of consequence. The world, which was currently busy grappling with the implications of the atom, the fragility of the stock market, and the terrifying speed of the new century, took one look at this honey-loving bear and decided that, yes, this was exactly what we needed. We needed a retreat. We needed a place where the only thing at stake was whether or not a pot of honey was empty, and where the most pressing diplomatic crisis involved a balloon and a misunderstanding about the weather. The literary critics, a group of men who possess the uncanny ability to take the joy out of a sunrise simply by explaining the mechanics of light refraction, were at first baffled. They looked for the satire, They looked for the political allegory, and they looked for the hidden message about the decline of the British Empire. They found nothing but a bear who was genuinely confused by the existence of his own feet. It was maddening. How is one to review a book that refuses to be anything other than what it is? It is like trying to critique a cloud. No matter how much you poke at it, it remains stubbornly a cloud. But the children, and more importantly, the parents who were desperate for a way to stop their children from asking questions about why the world was such a noisy, frantic, and confusing place, hailed the book as a triumph. Within months, the toy industry, a machine that can smell a trend from 3 continents away, had realized that a depressed donkey named Eeyore and an anxious piglet named Piglet were precisely the sort of emotional mirrors that a post-war population, still shivering from the memory of the Great War and the uncertainty of the future, needed to purchase for their offspring. It is a fascinating, if slightly cynical, metamorphosis. We take a quiet, gentle story about the comforts of friendship and the importance of a well-timed nap, and we turn it into a catalog. We start with the bear, and before you know it, we have the pajamas, the tea sets, the bed sheets, and the plush likenesses of the entire 100-acre wood, each one designed to be clutched by a child who is trying to figure out how to navigate the complexities of being a human in a world that seems to be losing its mind. We are a race that consumes comfort with the same gluttony that Pooh consumes honey. We are terrified of the emptiness of our own homes, so we fill them with stuffed animals and manufactured whimsy, hoping that if we surround ourselves with enough symbols of innocence, we might be able to stave off the encroaching reality of adulthood for just a little while longer. It is a noble, if doomed, effort. The industry, of course, loves it. They have turned the act of childhood into a branch of the retail sector. They know that a parent's love is a bottomless, insecure well, and that if you can sell them a little bit of peace and quiet in the form of a stuffed bear, they will pay whatever price is asked. It is the birth of the comfort economy, an empire built on the back of a bear who wouldn't know a quarterly earnings report if it bit him on his fuzzy golden rear end. I cannot help but admire the irony. Here is a book that celebrates the virtues of stillness, of the simple pleasure of an afternoon spent with friends, and of the realization that you don't need to do anything to be valuable. And yet, the very success of that sentiment has led to a frantic, commercial scramble to own it, to package it, and to sell it back to us in every form imaginable. We have taken the most non-commercial, anti-ambitious character in the history of literature and made him the mascot of the modern toy store. If Pooh were to walk into a department store today and see an entire shelf dedicated to his own likeness, I suspect he would be very polite, say, "Oh, bother," and then ask if any of the items were edible. It is, in its own way, a bit of a tragedy. We are so busy trying to purchase the feeling of simplicity that we have lost the ability to actually experience it. We want the bear, we want the forest, and we want the wisdom of the bear, but we want it delivered in a box, ready to be unwrapped on a birthday morning. We want the peace of the 100-acre wood without the inconvenience of having to go there, sit in the dirt, and wait for a thought to occur to us. And yet, there is something deeply, undeniably poignant about the way we cling to these things. We are all, in our heart of hearts, a bit like Eeyore, looking for our tails, feeling as though the world has forgotten us and convinced that the sky's about to fall, even if we are the only ones standing under it. We are all a bit like Piglet, worried about things that haven't happened yet and will likely never happen. And we are all a bit like Pooh, wandering through the woods of our own lives, stumbling over our own feet, and hoping that someone has remembered to leave a bit of honey in the cupboard. Perhaps that is why the book works. It is not because of the commerce, and it is not because of the toy industry, and it is certainly not because of the literary critics. It is because it reminds us that it is all right to be a bit broken, a bit confused, and a bit slow. It reminds us that friendship is the only cure for the existential dread that keeps us awake at night, and that sometimes the most important thing you can do is to sit on a log, look at the trees, and wait for the world to come back to you. I find I have a great deal of respect for Mr. Milne. He managed to write a book that is entirely useless in the most wonderful way possible. He didn't try to teach us how to make money, or how to win an argument, or how to build a better machine. He just gave us a bear who likes to talk to bees. And in doing so, he gave us a gift that the commerce of the world, for all its cleverness, can never truly contain. You can buy the stuffed bear, you can buy the sheets, and you can buy the whole set, but you cannot buy the feeling of sitting in the woods with your best friend, waiting for nothing in particular. That is free, and it is the only thing in this modern commercial world that is worth a damn. So, let the toy stores have their fill. Let them sell their trinkets and their plush illusions. It is a harmless enough game, and if it brings a little bit of quiet to a house that is otherwise filled with the noise of the century, then I say, let them have at it. But let us not forget the bear. Let us remember that beneath the branding and the commerce, there is a simple truth. We are all just trying to get through the day without getting our heads stuck in a jar, and if we can find a friend to help us pull it off, well, then we have done better than most. It is a charming little story, and I am glad it was written. It adds a bit of color to the gray landscape of the year, a bit of warmth to the cold, metallic rattle of progress. And if the price of that warmth is a few shelves of stuffed bears in every department store from here to the Pacific, I suppose it is a price I am willing to pay. After all, the world is a cold, indifferent place, and any bear, even one who is made of cotton and synthetic fuzz, who reminds us that friendship is the real gold, is a bear worth having around, even if he does from time to time act as if his brain is made entirely of fluff, which I suspect is the secret to his success. It is very hard to be miserable when your head is full of nothing but clouds and a vague, persistent desire for a snack. Perhaps in the end, that is the most intellectual realization of all. Chapter 13. Violet Gibson's Near Miss. It is a profound and unsettling truth that the course of human history, that great, heavy, and often suffocating tapestry of events, is frequently snagged on the most trivial of threads. We like to imagine that the destiny of nations is decided by the slow grinding machinery of statecraft, by the careful deliberations of parliaments, and by the grand visions of generals who possess maps and monocles. But the reality, as any man who has spent enough time watching the world spin, is that the future is just as likely to be dictated by the presence of a fly, a sudden sneeze, or a person who simply decides that they have had quite enough of a dictator's face. In the spring of 1926, the city of Rome, a place that has seen more than its fair share of emperors, pontiffs, and various other varieties of self-important men, was playing host to Benito Mussolini. Now, Mussolini was a fellow who had elevated the art of being a nuisance to the status of a national religion. He marched, he postured, he stuck his chin out until it looked as though it were trying to escape his face, and he insisted that the entire world pay attention to his every utterance, which were, in truth, mostly a collection of loud, empty noises meant to disguise the fact that he was essentially a small man playing a very large and very dangerous game of dress-up. He was the man of the hour, or at least the man of the very loud, very annoying hour, and he was convinced, with the absolute, unshakable confidence of a man who has never been told no by anyone with a weapon, that he was divinely appointed to lead Italy back to the glory days of the Caesars. He was, in his own mind, the new Augustus, provided that Augustus had possessed a fondness for balcony shouting and a distinct lack of any recognizable sense of humor. On a day that was bright, crisp, and altogether too pleasant for the sort of unpleasant business that was about to unfold, Mussolini was out and about, doing what dictators do, enjoying the adulation of the crowd and looking for an opportunity to project his own importance onto the scenery. He was surrounded by the usual assortment of sycophants and security men, a collection of fellows whose primary talent was looking stern and pretending that the dictator's jokes were the height of wit. Enter Violet Gibson. Miss Gibson was an Irish woman of a certain age, a lady whose life had, by all accounts, not been a particularly smooth or rewarding road. She was, in the parlance of the time, troubled, a word that the authorities use when they want to excuse their own inability to understand a person who doesn't fit into the neat, tidy boxes of social expectation. She was a woman who had lived a bit, suffered a bit, and possessed a degree of clarity that most people spend their entire lives trying to avoid. She walked up to the dictator, her gait calm and entirely unremarkable. She looked for all the world like a lady who was searching for a missing glove or perhaps looking for the best price on oranges in the marketplace. But in her hand she carried not a shopping list, but a revolver, a proper, honest, and entirely functional revolver. She didn't shout. She didn't make a speech. She didn't demand an audience. She simply walked up to the man who was currently holding the entire country in a state of high-strung, nervous submission, leveled the weapon at his face, and pulled the trigger. The bullet, had it been allowed to complete its intended journey, would have put a rather definitive end to the theatrical career of Il Duce. It would have changed the history of the century, spared the world an immense amount of misery, and saved us all a great deal of trouble. But at that exact, critical, and frankly infuriating second, Mussolini turned his head to look at a passing flag. The bullet, instead of ending a dictatorship, merely grazed the dictator's nose, leaving him with a scratch that was, in the grand scheme of things, about as important as a mosquito bite, but which he would spend the rest of his life treating as a wholly martyred wound. It is the supreme comedy of the situation. The world's most dangerous man, the man who was trying to convince everyone that he was an invincible force of nature, was saved by a sudden interest in a bit of colored fabric. He wasn't saved by his security, he wasn't saved by his brilliance, and he wasn't saved by the providence of the heavens. He was saved by a quirk of geometry and a passing banner. The fallout was, of course, entirely typical. Mussolini, who knew that the best way to handle a brush with mortality is to pretend it was actually a divine endorsement, immediately put a bandage on his snout and declared that his nose was now a sacred, protected object, shielded by the hand of the Almighty. He used the incident to crack down on his opponents, to tighten his grip on the press, and to portray himself as a man who was literally untouchable. He was, he claimed, the chosen one, the man who could stare down a bullet and win. And what of Miss Gibson? She was, predictably, packed away to an asylum, removed from the public eye and treated as a curiosity, a woman whose action was dismissed as the product of an unbalanced mind. It is a convenient way to treat people who do the things that the rest of us are too timid or too polite to attempt. If a person does something brave and it succeeds, we call it heroism. If they do it and it fails, we call it insanity. Miss Gibson had the misfortune of failing by a fraction of an inch, and so the world had the luxury of dismissing her as a mad woman. But I find myself wondering, who was the truly unbalanced one in that exchange? Was it the woman who looked at a bully, recognized him for exactly what he was, and decided to do something about it? Or was it the man who was so convinced of his own divinity that he actually believed his own nose was under the personal protection of the Creator? I know which side of that ledger I would place my bets on, though I suspect it would not be a popular position to take in the halls of power. There is a lesson here, a cruel and biting one. We are all living in a world where the outcome is everything and the intent is nothing. We applaud the winner of the race, regardless of whether he cheated, and we mock the runner who trips, regardless of how fast he was going. We are a people who value the result over the process, and we are surprised when we find ourselves led by men who have mastered the art of failing upwards. I imagine Miss Gibson sitting in her room, years later, watching the world slide toward the abyss, and I wonder if she ever thinks back to that day in Rome. Does she remember the weight of the gun in her hand? Does she remember the sound of the trigger? Or does she just remember the flag, that damned, fluttering, inconsequential piece of fabric that decided the fate of millions? It is the sort of thing that would keep a man awake at night, provided he had a conscience to keep him company. But the world is a cold place, and it does not care about the near misses. It only cares about the hits. And so the history books will tell the story of the dictator who survived, and they will relegate the woman who tried to stop him to the footnotes of the forgotten. But I shall remember her. I shall remember the woman who walked into the center of the stage, looked the tyrant in the eye, and tried to set the plot right. She failed, yes, she failed by the width of a man's nose, but she tried. And in a world that is so often content to watch the show without bothering to complain about the quality of the acting, that is a start. As for Mussolini, he got his wish. He spent the next few years strutting and posing and believing his own press, convinced that he was the man who had outwitted a bullet. And for a while it worked. He became a cartoon, a caricature of power, a man who was so obsessed with his own reflection that he didn't notice the world was slowly, inexorably turning against him. He was a man who lived by the theatrics, and in the end he would die by them, though that is a story for a later chapter. For now, I can only marvel at the sheer, improbable, and entirely absurd nature of it all. We are not led by geniuses, we are not led by saints, and we are certainly not led by men who are protected by God. We are led by the lucky, by the loud, and by the people who have the good sense to turn their heads at the right moment. It is a terrifying realization, but once you accept it, you can stop looking for meaning in the grand events and start looking for it in the small ones. You can look for the fly that lands on the general's nose. You can look for the sneeze that interrupts the treaty. You can look for the flag that catches the eye of the dictator and saves his life. It is all a comedy, a grand, sweeping, and entirely ridiculous comedy. We are just the audience, and we are expected to applaud, to weep, and to buy our tickets for the next performance. I suppose I shall go and order a glass of wine, find a comfortable chair, and watch the next act. I suspect it will be just as chaotic, just as pointless, and just as deeply, fundamentally hilarious as this one. And maybe, just maybe next time, someone will remember to bring a steadier hand, or perhaps someone will have the good sense to remove the flag before the dictator walks by. It is a small thing, really, but as I have learned, the small things are the only ones that ever truly matter. Chapter 14. The Showa Dawn. Enter Hirohito. The year 1926, which had already demonstrated a most remarkable capacity for shedding its skin, concluded with one of those great, somber, and inherently theatrical shifts that occur whenever the world decides it is time to trade one era for another. The Taisho Emperor, a man who had presided over a Japan in the midst of a violent and dizzying transformation, finally folded his hand and exited the game. His departure was marked by the sort of stiff, formal, and agonizingly slow procession that the Japanese court has perfected over the centuries, a pageant of shadow and silk that makes the rest of the world's royal displays look like a gathering of rowdy children at a county fair. In his place, ascending to the chrysanthemum throne with all the gravity of a man stepping onto a tightrope, was his 25-year-old son, Hirohito. The name chosen for the new era was Showa, which translates roughly to enlightened peace. It is a title of such lofty, optimistic, and entirely untarnished ambition that it could only have been conceived by a group of scholars who spent their entire lives reading poetry and looking at scrolls. It was a beautiful name, a name that tasted of spring blossoms and steady, rhythmic breathing. It was the sort of name that suggested that humanity had finally learned its lesson, that the fires of the past had burned away all the petty grudges, and that the future was to be a long, unbroken stretch of polite, mutually beneficial commerce and quiet contemplation. How rarely it happens that a name survives the first encounter with the jagged, uncooperative reality of the human condition. Young Hirohito was a man of quiet, scientific temperament. He had a passion for marine biology, for the delicate, slime-covered secrets of the tide pools, and for the kind of solitary intellectual work that keeps a man from noticing that his advisors are currently sharpening their bayonets in the basement. He was, by all accounts, a fellow who would have been perfectly content to spend his life categorizing jellyfish, indifferent to the demands of geopolitics or the clamor of the imperialistic appetite. But destiny, that cruel and unfeeling stage manager, had shoved him onto a platform that required him to be a living, breathing symbol of a nation that was currently feeling quite convinced of its own manifest importance. He sat there, surrounded by the gold, the incense, and the ancient, echoing silence of the palace, while the world outside his window began to roar. It was a roar of industry, a roar of militarism, and a roar of a people who had looked at the West and decided that if they were to survive, they would have to become more efficient, more brutal, and more ambitious than the very empires that had taught them the game in the first place. Japan, in this year of the Showa dawn, was a place of frantic, jittery paradoxes. You had young men in Western suits sipping coffee in the parlors of Tokyo, discussing the finer points of modern architecture and the works of French poets, while only a few miles away, the industrial military complex was humming with a dark, steady, and increasingly demanding hunger. The shipyards were churning out steel-skinned leviathans, the factories were stamping out rifles, and the halls of power were filled with the sort of men who believe that the only way to ensure enlightened peace is to make sure that no one else has enough ammunition to complain about it. It is a comedy, truly, the comedy of the well-meaning scholar placed at the head of a steam-powered avalanche. The emperor was a student of the sea, a man who understood the slow, ancient life cycles of the deep, and he was now the captain of a vessel that was trying to outrun its own shadow. He was a symbol of enlightened peace in an era that was being systematically dismantled by the men who knew that peace is just another word for the period between the time we get the guns and the time we use them. I look at the portraits of him from that time, the high, stiff collar, the eyes that look as though they are perpetually searching for a microscope, the posture of a man who is trying very hard not to be noticed, and I feel a strange, hollow sort of pity. He was, in many ways, the ultimate victim of the era. He was a man who wanted to observe the world, and instead he was forced to be its centerpiece. He was a man who preferred the company of organisms that didn't have opinions, and he was surrounded by advisors whose only business was to have the most dangerous opinions imaginable. The irony of the Showa era is that the very people who were loudest in their praise of this enlightened peace were the ones who were most actively ensuring that it would never come to pass. They used the emperor's name like a talisman, a bit of magic to justify every encroachment, every occupation, and every act of aggression. They would march into a neighboring territory, torch the fields, and then declare that they were doing so to preserve the enlightened peace of the emperor. It is the oldest trick in the history of the human comedy. If you want to perform a villainy, do it in the name of a virtue. It makes the pill go down so much easier, and it gives the press something nice to put in the headlines. I wonder, did he know? As he sat there in his palace, reading the reports of his generals and the summaries of his advisers, did he see the avalanche coming? Did he look at the charts and the graphs and see that the enlightened peace was being built on a foundation of bayonets? Or was he, like the rest of us, caught in the fog of his own circumstances, believing that the world was still a place that could be measured, categorized, and eventually understood? We like to think that leaders are the authors of history, but the reality is much closer to the truth that they are merely the actors who have been handed the script. Hirohito had been handed a script that demanded he be a god, a patriot, and a visionary, all while his own soul was clearly elsewhere, likely somewhere in a quiet harbor, observing the life cycle of a crustacean. He was a man out of time, a man out of place, and a man who was ultimately responsible for a series of events that would consume the entire world in fire. But that is a story for later years, for the days when the clouds become too thick to see the sun. In 1926, the Showa dawn was still new. It was still fresh, it was still promising, and it was still, in the eyes of the hopeful, a vision of something beautiful. There is a melancholy in that, the melancholy of watching a new day begin when you already know that it is going to end in a storm. It is the tragedy of being human, We are always looking for the light. We are always choosing the names that sound like grace, and we are always setting the stage for our own undoing. We call it enlightened peace, and we start the tanks. We call it the great civilization, and we start the wars. We are so very good at naming things, and so very bad at living up to them. As for me, I find I have a strange, lingering affection for the young emperor. I think of him in his laboratory, the only place where the laws of nature are consistent and the consequences are never political. I think of him as a man who would have been much happier if he had just been a marine biologist, a man who would have lived a long, productive, and entirely peaceful life labeling samples in a quiet room, away from the madness of the world. But he wasn't allowed that. He was allowed only the title, the throne, and the burden of a name that meant everything and nothing at all. So let the era of Showa begin. Let the flags wave, let the anthem swell, and let the advisors go back to their basements to finish sharpening their blades. It is a new dawn, and it is a beautiful, terrible thing to behold. I shall watch it with a heavy heart and a curious eye, waiting to see what happens when the scholar is forced to become the warrior, and when the peace that was promised turns out to be the quietest, most polite, and most deadly thing of all. It is a play I have seen before, and I suspect I shall see it again, but that doesn't make the ending any less difficult to watch. The curtain has risen, the emperor is on the throne, and the rest of the world is waiting to see if we have truly become enlightened or if we have just found a new, more efficient way to ruin ourselves. My money, for what it is worth, is on the ruin. It is, after all, the one thing we never seem to lose our appetite for. Chapter 15. Germany enters the parlor. There is a peculiar, stubborn, and altogether magnificent optimism that defines the human race, an optimism that remains entirely unperturbed by the minor detail that we spend half our time setting our own houses on fire. In the year of our Lord 1926, the League of Nations, a collection of diplomats, statesmen, and assorted self-important fellows who had collectively decided that the world was now entirely too sophisticated for the messy, ungentlemanly business of total war, decided that the time had come for a grand gesture. They voted with a unanimity that would have made a chorus of trained seals weep with envy to admit Germany as a permanent member of their hallowed, echo-filled chambers. It was a scene of such choreographed, high-minded sincerity that it could only have been staged in a place like Geneva, a city that seems to exist solely to provide a neutral backdrop for the signing of documents that everyone secretly knows will be ignored the moment the weather turns cold. The statesmen shook hands until their knuckles must have ached. They signed papers with pens that had been blessed by the ghost of hope, and they congratulated themselves on having permanently, irrevocably, and with absolute finality cured Europe of its tiresome, hereditary habit of self-destruction. I have spent a good deal of time watching the maneuvers of the great powers, and I have found that whenever a politician uses the word permanently, you would be well advised to check your pockets, hide your children, and start looking for a sturdy cellar. The League, you see, was the ultimate parlor trick. It was a beautiful, shiny, and utterly hollow container meant to hold the spirit of peace. But it had one fatal flaw. It was built by people who believed that if you simply rearranged the chairs in the drawing room, the house would stop shaking. Germany, meanwhile, entered this parlor with the measured, cautious tread of a guest who has been invited to a dinner party, by the very people who were trying to burn his house down only 8 years prior. They were, in the view of the League, a reformed nation, a description that suggests one can simply decide to be a new person, like a man who wakes up on a Tuesday and decides he is no longer a gambler, ignoring the fact that his pockets are still full of loaded dice. The statesmen bowed, they scraped, and they spoke in tones of such profound, syrup-soaked reconciliation that you would have thought they were witnessing the arrival of a delegation of angels, rather than a group of men representing a country that was currently nursing a grudge the size of the Black Forest. The brilliance of the comedy lies in the earnestness of the participants. They truly believed that if they could get everyone in the same room, sit them at the same table, and make them listen to the same droning speeches, the grievances of history would simply vanish like mist in the morning sun. It is a lovely idea, the sort of thing that sounds absolutely marvelous in a poem or a Sunday sermon. But in the world of men, where the memory of blood is long and the desire for vengeance is as constant as the rising of the sun, it is a farce. I imagine the representatives of the League walking home that night, feeling very tall, very wise, and very satisfied with their work. They had done the right thing. They had extended the hand of brotherhood. They had brought the prodigal son back into the parlor, and they were entirely blind to the fact that they were simply inviting the wolf to take a seat at the table, convinced that if they just fed him enough tea and biscuits, he would eventually forget he had a taste for mutton. It is a curious thing, this habit we have of treating the world as if it were a polite negotiation over a property line, rather than a volatile, shifting, and deeply unpredictable brawl. We build our institutions, our leagues, and our treaties, and we act as if we have shackled history itself, as if we have finally invented a cage for the monster. But history, like any creature that has been penned in against its will, eventually finds a way out. It always does. It simply waits for the statesman to get tired, for the pens to run dry, and for the optimism to curdle into the same old, tired, and predictable desperation. The delegates were so busy shaking hands that they didn't notice the tremors. They didn't see the men waiting in the shadows of the German Parliament, the ones who had no interest in tea and biscuits, the ones who saw the League for exactly what it was, a toothless, decorative, and thoroughly pathetic ornament of a world that didn't have the stomach to defend itself. The permanent membership was, in their eyes, a permanent joke, a temporary stall, until they could regain their footing and set the table for a much, much bigger meal. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if, instead of signing papers, the delegates had simply told the truth. Imagine, if you will, the League of Nations convening in the hall, the silence stretching out, and one of them standing up to say, "My friends, we are all deeply suspicious of one another. We are all nursing wounds that will never heal, and we are all terrified that the moment we look away, the person sitting next to us will reach for a knife. But we are here, we are tired, and for the next few years we would prefer not to die in a muddy field." It would have been honest. It would have been human. And more importantly, it would have been a hell of a lot safer than all that flowery, dishonest, and hollow diplomacy. But that is not the way of the parlor. In the parlor, you must be polite. You must smile. You must pretend that the elephant in the room is just another piece of furniture. And so, the farce continues, and the stage is set for an ending that everyone sees coming, but that no one has the courage to stop. The entry of Germany into the League was the high watermark of this polite, deluded era. It was the moment we convinced ourselves that we had achieved the impossible, that we had bridged the chasm with words alone. We were so proud of our cleverness. We had turned a battlefield into a committee, and we thought that was a victory. It was a victory, I suppose, if you happen to define victory as the ability to ignore the encroaching storm until the very last drop of rain hits your nose. As for the Germans, they accepted the invitation with the same pragmatism that a prisoner accepts a slightly more comfortable cell. They needed the time, they needed the legitimacy, and they were more than happy to let the statesmen indulge in their fantasies of enlightened peace while they set about the business of rebuilding. They were the only ones in the room who understood the game. They knew that the League was a stage, that the speeches were a distraction, and that the real work, the work of muscle and steel and the cold, hard logic of force, was happening elsewhere, far away from the polished tables and the fountain pens of Geneva. So let us raise a glass to the statesmen, let us applaud their optimism, let us marvel at their gullibility, and let us admire the sheer, breathtaking audacity of a world that thinks it can prevent a hurricane by holding an umbrella over the thermometer. It is a grand, sweeping, and entirely ridiculous show, and I, for one, would hate to miss the climax. It is, after all, the only one we are ever going to get. The parlor is full, the guests have been seated, and the music is beginning to play. It's a very polite, very civilized, and very deadly tune, but the delegates don't seem to notice. They are too busy shaking hands and congratulating themselves on how far they have come. And in the corner, quiet and unnoticed, the shadow of the next war is already pulling up a chair. It's going to be quite a party, I suspect. The only question is, who will be left to clean up the mess when the music finally stops? My money is on the ghosts. They are the only ones who ever truly appreciate the irony of it all. Chapter 16. The Book of the Month Club. There is a peculiar aching vanity that resides in the breast of the average American citizen, a vanity that is not satisfied by mere material comforts, but demands the acquisition of something a bit more substantial, or at the very least, something that looks substantial on the mantelpiece. We are a people who desire to be thought of as cultured, as refined, as the sort of fellows who spend their evenings discussing the nuances of Tolstoy while sipping something that has been aged in an oak barrel. We want the reputation of a scholar, you see, but we are for the most part entirely too busy, too tired, or too preoccupied with the business of making a living to actually open a book and read the confounded things. In the year of our Lord 1926, an enterprising marketer by the name of Harry Sherman looked at this national dilemma, the vast, unbridgeable chasm between our desire to appear intellectual and our profound laziness, and had a revelation that was as simple as it was predatory. He realized that if you could automate the acquisition of literature, if you could remove the terrifying labor-intensive necessity of walking into a bookstore, choosing a volume, and engaging in the awkward social interaction of a purchase, you could turn the entire nation into a library of unread masterpieces. He founded the Book of the Month Club. It was a system that functioned with the cold, mechanical precision of a tax collector. Every 30 days, without fail, a parcel would arrive on your doorstep containing a book that a committee of distinguished intellectuals had deemed to be essential for your spiritual and social development. And along with that parcel, like a persistent, unwelcome guest, came the bill. It was the birth of the literary subscription, or what I like to call curated guilt for your nightstand. It was a stroke of genius, really. It took the agonizing uncertainty of selection out of the hands of the common man and placed it in the hands of an elite, hand-picked panel of judges who looked, smelled, and acted exactly the way people who have read a great many books are supposed to look, smell, and act. You didn't have to worry about whether a book was good or serious or the sort of thing that would impress the minister if he stopped by for a visit. The committee had already decided for you. All you had to do was pay the fee and place the book on your shelf where it would sit, spine pristine and pages uncreased, acting as a mute, dusty monument to your own imaginary erudition. I imagine the scene in thousands of parlors across the country. A gentleman, having just finished his day of labor, hears the thud of the parcel on the porch. He picks it up, inspects the wrapper with a sense of duty that borders on the religious, and carries it into the library. He opens the book, sighs at the length of the chapters, maybe reads the first 2 pages if he is feeling particularly ambitious, and then with a feeling of profound relief, slides it onto the shelf next to the set of encyclopedias he also hasn't opened since the Taft administration. He has done his part. He has purchased the culture. He has secured his standing as a man of letters. He can now go to sleep with the comforting knowledge that he is, in spirit, a philosopher, even if, in practice, he is a man who mostly enjoys the sports pages and a bit of gossip. There is something deeply, inherently funny about the whole affair. We have managed to turn the pursuit of wisdom into a commodity, a subscription service that can be managed with the same casual indifference as a milk delivery. We have stripped the act of reading of its mystery, its struggle, and its joy, and replaced it with a monthly, automatic, and entirely manageable dose of improvement. We are not reading, you see. We are acquiring. We are building a fort of knowledge that we never intend to inhabit, a fortress of culture that is essentially a hollow shell. And the marketers, they know exactly what they are doing. They play on that peculiar, uniquely human fear, the fear of being found out, the fear of being revealed as a person who doesn't know the difference between the classics and the pulp, the fear of sitting at a dinner party and having someone bring up a title that you have never even heard of. They are selling us an alibi. Every time we receive a parcel, we are receiving a certificate of intelligence that we can display to our neighbors. It is a brilliant, ruthless, and entirely American strategy. I have often thought that if the great authors of the past, those fellows who spent their lives sweating blood over their prose, starving in garrets and pouring their very souls into their ink, could see what has become of their life's work, they would likely be tempted to come back from the grave and sue for emotional distress. Imagine the horror of realizing that your magnum opus is currently being used as a paperweight, or that it is serving no higher purpose than to fill a gap between a bust of Napoleon and a vase of artificial flowers. It is the ultimate indignity. To be read is one thing, to be owned as a decoration is quite another. And yet, is it really so bad? I suppose there is a certain quiet nobility in the act of buying a book, even if you never intend to read it. It is an acknowledgment, however faint, that there is something out there that is worth saving, something that is worth having, even if it is only as a prop in the theater of our own lives. We are paying homage to the idea of literature, even if we are too busy to pay homage to the practice of it. We are keeping the publishers in business, we are keeping the printers busy, and we are, at the very least, keeping the books from being pulped into cardboard boxes. That is something, I suppose, but it makes me wonder about the state of our minds. We are becoming a society of collectors, a society of curators who are more interested in the appearance of knowledge than in the messy, difficult, and transformative reality of it. We want the benefits of a library without the burden of the library card. We want the wisdom of the ages to be delivered to our door without us having to exert the effort to go and look for it. It is the ultimate manifestation of our desire for the path of least resistance. I see these advertisements in the journals, promising to transform your intellect and expand your horizons for the low, low price of a few dollars a month, and I cannot help but laugh, as if the intellect were a balloon that could be inflated with a subscription, as if the horizons were something you could purchase at the local post office. We are a nation of people who have forgotten that the only way to read a book is to pick it up, open it, and let the words do the work of changing you, whether you like it or not. You cannot be changed by a book that is sitting on a shelf, and you cannot be enlightened by a committee that has never met you. But perhaps that is the point. We don't want to be changed. We want to stay exactly as we are, only with the added satisfaction of knowing that we are surrounded by the potential to be changed. We want the aura of the intellectual without the nuisance of the transformation. We want the comfort of the status quo and the peace of mind that comes with knowing that, should we ever find ourselves with a free afternoon and a sudden, uncharacteristic urge to become a scholar, the resources are right there, waiting for us. I shall continue to haunt the second-hand shops, looking for the books that have actually been read, the ones with the dog-eared pages, the notes in the margins, and the unmistakable smell of human fingerprints and tobacco smoke. Those are the books that have lived. Those are the books that have been fought over, loved, hated, and worn down by the sheer, stubborn persistence of the human eye. They are not subscription services. They are survivors. And they have a great deal more to say than any parcel that ever arrived on a doorstep, pre-selected by a committee of strangers. But for the rest of you, by all means, subscribe. Build your shelves high. Fill your parlors with the latest, greatest, and most distinguished titles, and enjoy the comfort of your curated guilt. It is a grand, whimsical, and thoroughly modern way to spend your money. And who knows? Maybe one of these days, when the radio is silent and the car is in the garage, and you have nothing better to do than to stare at your mantelpiece, you might just find yourself reaching for one of those books. And if you do, be careful. You might find that once you start, you won't be able to stop. And then, heaven help you, you'll be a reader, and you'll have to find a new way to spend your Sunday afternoons. It is a dangerous business reading, but it's the only one that truly matters. Chapter 17, The Throat Clearing of the Talkies, Vitaphone. In the year of 1926, the silent film industry was a great, prosperous, and entirely delusional empire. It was a kingdom where the actors moved with the exaggerated, semaphore-like gestures of a man trying to signal a passing ship, where the plots were held together by the sheer, desperate willpower of the title cards, and where the most important person in the theater was not the director or the star, but a fellow in the orchestra pit who could play the piano fast enough to simulate the sound of a runaway train. It was a golden age of pantomime, a time when humanity had collectively agreed that the world was best experienced in black and white, accompanied by the occasional rhythmic clunking of a projectionist's machinery. But then, the wizards of Warner Brothers decided that they had had quite enough of the silence. They had discovered a new toy, a gadgetry of wires, wax, and synchronized electricity called the Vitaphone, and they were determined to use it to perform the most audacious, the most intrusive, and the most fundamentally unnecessary feat of mechanical engineering yet. They were going to make the movies talk, or, to be more precise, they were going to make them moan in a synchronized fashion. The premiere of Don Juan was the event of the season, a night of such high-strung, nervous anticipation that you would have thought they were debuting a new religion rather than a new way to listen to an orchestra. The audience filed into the theater with the solemnity of congregants, fully aware that they were about to witness the end of the world as they knew it. When the lights dimmed and the curtain rose, the sound that hit them was not the sound of a human voice, but the sound of a recorded orchestra, a rich, booming, and slightly metallic symphony of sound that seemed to be emanated by the screen itself. It was a shock, a profound, rattling shock. People who had spent their entire lives reading the screen were suddenly forced to listen to it. The actors, of course, remained silent, a mercy for which we should all be eternally grateful, because the technology, in its infantile state, had not yet mastered the delicate art of matching a human lip to a human word. They moved their mouths in the usual frantic, silent film fashion, like fish gasping for air in a bowl, while the orchestra roared behind them with the insistence of a gale. It was, in truth, a bit like watching a ghost perform at a concert. It was an uncanny, unsettling, and thoroughly unnatural marriage of light and sound. The theater musicians, those venerable guardians of the dramatic tempo, sat in their pits and watched their own obsolescence approaching with the speed of a tax bill. They saw the writing on the wall, and the writing was, quite literally, "Your services are no longer required." They looked at their sheet music, then at the screen, and then at one another, with the dawning cold-blooded horror of a group of blacksmiths watching the first Model T roll down the street. The industry, meanwhile, began to vibrate with the sheer, unadulterated terror of the innovator. Every producer in Hollywood suddenly found himself in a state of existential panic. Should they switch? Could they switch? Was this talkie business a fad, a temporary spasm of technological vanity that would pass like a bad fever? Or was it the new, permanent, and entirely unavoidable reality? They paced their offices, they yelled at their writers, and they spent their fortunes buying up every patent and every inventor who claimed to have a way to pipe sound through a projector. It was a glorious, frantic, and entirely ridiculous scramble. You had directors who had spent their entire careers perfecting the art of the meaningful gaze, suddenly trying to figure out how to direct a dialogue, and stars who had built their reputations on the beauty of their eyes, suddenly realizing that the public might actually want to hear what they had to say, and that, in many cases, what they had to say was, "Where is my contract?" or "I don't think I like the way that sounds." I imagine the process of filming these early talkies to be a task of such immense and exquisite frustration that it would have driven a saint to arson. You had to place the microphones in hidden, improbable locations, inside vases, behind draperies, under chairs, and then instruct the actors to stand in a rigid, fixed, and entirely undramatic position, whispering their lines into the furniture as if they were confessing a sin. The result was a film that looked like a play, moved like a funeral, and sounded like a séance. And yet there was no stopping it. The genie was out of the bottle, and the genie was a brass-lunged, syncopated, and entirely relentless creature that refused to be quieted. The audience, despite the initial discomfort, despite the slightly metallic, tinny quality of the sound, and despite the fact that the actors looked as though they were suffering from a bad case of indigestion, was hooked. They wanted to hear the music. They wanted to hear the sound effects, the clatter of the horse's hooves, the shatter of the glass, the bang of the door. They wanted to be enveloped, to be transported, and to have the illusion completed by the addition of the auditory. It is the nature of the human animal. We are never satisfied with half a dream. We want the full, technicolor, high-decibel experience. We want the world to be a perfect, seamless, and entirely immersive copy of our own, and we are willing to sacrifice any amount of nuance, any amount of art, and any amount of silence to achieve it. We are not interested in the idea of a drama. We want the noise of one. The orchestra musicians, bless their hearts, did their best to put up a fight. They went on strike, they petitioned, and they played their hearts out, trying to prove that a live human performance, with all its flaws, its spontaneity, and its sweat, was superior to a recording on a wax disc. But they were fighting a war they had already lost. You cannot compete with a machine that never gets tired, never demands a raise, and never hits a sour note. You cannot compete with a recording that sounds exactly the same on a Tuesday in New York as it does on a Thursday in Timbuktu. So the music moved to the screen, and the pit went silent. The theaters became temples of the recorded, where the same canned, processed, and preserved performance played on a loop, night after night, until the end of time. It was an efficiency that would have warmed the heart of a factory owner, but it felt like a bit of a theft to me. It felt like we were trading the soul of the performance for the convenience of the gadget. I wonder, what will happen when the actors finally find their voices? What will happen when the silence is gone and the theater is filled with the drone of human chatter? Will we miss the days when the title cards told us what was happening and we were left to imagine the voices for ourselves? I suspect we will. I suspect we will miss the days when we had to do a bit of the work, when we had to fill in the gaps with our own memories, our own longings, and our own private, internal monologues. When the actors started to speak, the mystery vanished. You could hear the arrogance in their voices, the insecurity in their tone, the sheer, unadulterated mediocrity of their thoughts. And suddenly, the grand, larger-than-life figures of the silent era were revealed to be just like the rest of us, only with better lighting and a better tailor. The talkie didn't make the movies better. It made them smaller. It brought them down to earth, and in the process, it stripped them of their, silence. And silence, as any man who has spent enough time in his own head knows, is where the real magic happens. So, let us toast the Vitaphone. Let us toast the clatter, the noise, and the throat-clearing of the new era. It is a loud, intrusive, and thoroughly modern way to spend an evening, and if you ask me, I think I shall look for a theater that still keeps a piano in the pit, even if I have to travel to the end of the earth to find one. There is something to be said for a bit of live human and wonderfully imperfect noise, and I, for one, am not yet ready to surrender to the machine. But then, I am an old man, and I have always had a weakness for the sound of a piano being played by someone who is clearly having a very, very bad day. It is the most honest music I know. Chapter 18, The Air Commerce Act, Traffic Cops for the Clouds. In the beginning, the sky was a vast, open, and utterly lawless expanse, a blue-tinted frontier where any man with a bit of canvas, a pile of sticks, and a truly reckless disregard for his own longevity could strap himself into a contraption and declare himself the master of the atmosphere. It was a golden age of aeronautical anarchy. You had farmers in Iowa building biplanes in their barns, mechanics in Ohio tinkering with engines that were more accustomed to powering cream separators, and young daredevils who looked at the clouds and saw not a ceiling, but a sidewalk. They flew where they pleased, landed in whichever pasture looked least likely to ruin their landing gear, and navigated by the time-honored method of pointing the nose toward the biggest city and hoping for the best. It was a glorious, suicidal, and entirely unsustainable way to travel. By 1926, the sky over America had become so crowded with these amateur birdmen, each of them weaving their own chaotic path through the ether, that the federal government, an institution that can smell a regulated commodity from 100 miles away, began to suffer from a collective case of the vapors. They looked up at the heavens, saw the crisscrossing contrails of 1,000 unauthorized adventures, and realized that if they didn't do something soon, the air was going to become a very hazardous place for anything that didn't have wings and a death wish. The result was the Air Commerce Act, a bit of legislation that essentially declared that since everyone with $500 and a lack of common sense was busy building an airplane, the government had better figure out who actually owned the sky. They created a new branch of the Department of Commerce, a group of fellows whose job was to license pilots, certify airplanes, and, most importantly, act as the world's first most confused traffic cops for the clouds. It is a task of such staggering administrative absurdity that it makes the regulation of the railroads look like a simple game of checkers. How, pray tell, do you direct traffic in 3 dimensions? How do you tell a man in a Jenny biplane to stay in his lane when he doesn't have a lane, and his idea of a detour involves taking a sudden vertical interest in the landscape? The government agents, bless their hearts, arrived at the airfields with their clipboards, their regulations, and their complete inability to fly anything more complex than a desk. They insisted that every pilot now be tested, that every machine be inspected, and that every flight plan be filed in triplicate, as if one could actually predict the path of a man who is currently wrestling with a stubborn rudder and a gust of wind that has a personal vendetta against his dignity. I recall visiting a small, dusty airstrip in the Midwest, a place that was essentially a flattened field with a windsock that looked like a discarded sock from a giant, and I watched the spectacle of the new traffic control. There was a government man, a fellow who looked as though he had spent his entire life in a windowless office in Washington, attempting to explain to a pilot, a man whose face was tanned the color of an old leather boot, and whose eyes had the squint of someone who has spent too much time looking for headwinds, that he was not permitted to perform a barrel roll over the town square. The pilot listened with the patient, condescending indulgence one might show to a toddler who has just explained the intricacies of the solar system. He nodded, he smiled, and he waited for the inspector to finish his lecture on the dangers of unauthorized aerobatics. Then the pilot climbed into his plane, started the engine with a roar that sent the inspector's hat into the next county, and proceeded to do exactly what he had always done. He flew, he rolled, and he laughed at the very idea that anyone could own the air. It is the great, recurring struggle of our time, the conflict between the man who wants to regulate the world and the man who wants to fly over it. The regulator looks at the sky and sees a map, a grid, a system that needs to be controlled. The pilot looks at the sky and sees an opportunity, a challenge, and a place where he can finally escape the reach of the man with the clipboard. And so, we have the birth of the traffic cop of the clouds. We have the licensing, the paperwork, and the stern official warnings, all designed to make the sky look a little more like a highway, and all of them doomed to fail. Because, you see, the sky doesn't care about regulations. The sky doesn't care about pilot licenses or airworthiness certificates or the fine print of the Department of Commerce. The sky only cares about the lift, the drag, and the pilot who has the nerve to pull the stick back when the ground is coming up to meet him. The government, of course, pretends that it is working. They issue their reports, they brag about their accident rates, and they act as if they have tamed the ether. And to be fair, they have made things a bit safer. They have forced the pilots to at least be aware that there are other people in the air. And they have discouraged the more egregious forms of aerial idiocy, like flying through church steeples or attempting to land on the top of a moving train. But the fundamental truth remains. The air is the last great and entirely untamable wilderness, and no amount of paperwork will ever change that. I find it all quite whimsical, this attempt to turn the heavens into a filing cabinet. We are so obsessed with control, so terrified of the unpredictable, that we have managed to convince ourselves that we can organize the wind, the clouds, and the very air itself. It is a prideful, foolish, and entirely human endeavor. We are the species that looks at the infinite and thinks, yes, I believe I shall put a stop sign here and perhaps a speed limit over there. And the pilots? The pilots continue to fly. They fill out the forms, they pay the fees, and they keep the licenses in their wallets. But when they are up there, suspended between the earth and the heavens, they are the same free, reckless, and thoroughly unmanageable creatures they have always been. They know that the government man is down there, safe on the ground, worrying about the rules, while they are up here, living the only life that makes any sense to them. I suppose the Air Commerce Act is a necessity. It is the price we pay for the progress of the machine, the trade-off we make for the ability to send mail, cargo, and people across the continent in a single roaring day. If we want the convenience of the flight, we must accept the burden of the regulation. It is a simple, cold, and entirely logical exchange, but I cannot help but mourn the loss of the anarchy. I cannot help but look back at those early days when the sky was a playground and the only law was the law of gravity, and wonder if we have really gained anything at all. We have traded our freedom for efficiency. We have traded our wonder for a set of guidelines. We have traded the wild, unpredictable, and terrifyingly beautiful experience of the pioneer for the safe, managed, and thoroughly boring experience of the traveler. And I suspect that in the long run, we will be much safer, much faster, and much, much less inspired. But that is the way of the world. The era of the barnstormer, the era of the wild-eyed flyer is coming to a close, and the era of the civil servant is taking its place. It is a change I am sure the insurance companies will appreciate, and it is a change I am sure will keep a great many pilots alive who would otherwise have met their end in a spectacular fashion. And for that, I suppose, I should be grateful. But if you happen to see a pilot flying a bit too close to the clouds or performing a maneuver that is not strictly, precisely, and entirely within the limits of the Department of Commerce's handbook, don't report him. Just watch. Just enjoy the spectacle of a man who still remembers that the sky was meant to be flown, not regulated. It is a rare, dying, and entirely beautiful sight. And who knows, maybe, just maybe, he's the last one who truly understands that the air doesn't belong to the government or the corporations or the traffic cops. The air belongs to the one who has the nerve to go up there and take it. And for as long as there is a bit of sky left and a bit of spirit left in the human heart, there will always be someone who is willing to take the chance. I, for one, shall be watching from the ground, wishing I were up there with them, cursing the fact that my own wings have always been made of paper, ink, and a very sturdy, very grounded, and very stubborn typewriter. It's a good trade, I think. But the view from the cockpit must be a great deal better than the view from the desk. It must be truly a bit of heaven. And heaven, if I know anything about it, is a place that shouldn't have any speed limits at all. Chapter 19. The Great Miami Interruption. It is a curious and melancholy fact that the American imagination is often at its most fertile when it is engaged in the profitable business of selling people things that do not, in any meaningful sense, exist. In the mid-1920s, there was no place on this green earth where this industry of high-toned delusion was more robustly active than in the swamps of Florida. Developers, a species of human that possesses the predatory instincts of a barracuda and the optimistic vocabulary of a tent revival preacher, were busy carving up the Everglades and selling them to the suckers of the North as the New Eden. They promised palm-fringed boulevards, Venetian-style canals, and a climate that would make an angel quit his post to take up residence in a bungalow. The boom was, to use the technical terminology of the time, a magnificent, roaring, and entirely unhinged spectacle. People were buying land they had never seen, paying prices that made the Dutch tulip merchants look like cautious, prudent investors. They were convinced that the future of the world was to be written in the sand of Florida, and they were tripping over one another in their rush to stake a claim on a slice of what was, in truth, a very humid, very mosquito-ridden, and very soggy piece of topography. And then, in the autumn of 1926, the Atlantic Ocean decided that it had had quite enough of this nonsense. The ocean has a memory that is long, patient, and entirely indifferent to the vanity of land titles. It had seen this patch of coast through 1,000 storms, and it knew that the land was not so much real estate as it was a temporary soggy truce between the water and the shore. When the Category 4 hurricane arrived, it didn't bother to knock. It didn't ask to see the blueprints for the Venetian canals, and it didn't take any interest in the zoning laws. It simply surged onto the coast with the cold, crushing authority of an ancient power returning to reclaim a debt that had been overdue for several centuries. The result was a spectacle of such devastating biblical proportions that it turned the entire Florida real estate dream into a watery, splintered, and thoroughly soggy grave. The new Eden vanished in an afternoon. The grand hotels, the stucco mansions, the carefully manicured palm trees were all swept away by the wind and the waves, leaving behind a landscape that looked less like a playground for the wealthy and more like the aftermath of a war fought between a bulldozer and a tsunami. I have spent a good deal of my life observing the follies of my fellow man, and I have found that there is nothing quite so humorous, if one has a sufficiently dark and detached sense of humor, as watching a group of people who are absolutely convinced of their own importance being reminded, in the most emphatic way possible, that they are, in fact, merely guests on a planet that does not care about their investments. The developers were running around with their ledgers and their maps, trying to explain to the sea that this land had been sold to a group of bankers in Chicago, and the sea, demonstrating a lack of interest in the fine print of legal contracts, responded by knocking down the front doors of their finest resorts. It is the supreme irony of the modern age. We build our monuments to our own cleverness, we sign our names to the deed, and we imagine that we have conquered the wilderness. And all the while, the earth, the wind, and the water are simply waiting for the right moment to show us that the deed is not worth the paper it is printed on. The Florida boom was a house of cards, and the hurricane was the breath of a god who had finally tired of the game. The tragedy, if one must call it that, is that we never learn. We see the destruction, we see the houses floating out to sea, and we see the dreams of the investors dissolving into the mud, and we tell ourselves that it was just a bad storm. We tell ourselves that next time we shall build higher, we shall build stronger, and we shall build better. We are an incurably optimistic species, a race that believes that if we just throw enough concrete at a problem, we can outwit the fundamental, restless energy of the world. I find myself thinking of those developers. I imagine them standing on the shore, knee-deep in the wreckage of their own ambitions, trying to figure out how to sell the disaster to the next wave of hopeful, gullible newcomers. "It's a ground-floor opportunity," they might cry, gesturing to the ruins of a beachfront hotel. The view is now quite literally infinite. It is a profession that requires a hide thicker than a rhinoceros and a conscience that has been thoroughly laundered in the bleach of perpetual, unshakable greed. But there is a lesson in the Miami interruption, though I fear it is one that will be conveniently forgotten by the time the next sunny season rolls around. The lesson is that the land does not belong to us. We are merely allowed to stay for a while, provided we respect the rules of the place. And the rule of the coast is that it belongs to the sea, and any attempt to pretend otherwise is just a fancy way of inviting the catastrophe to come and stay for a visit. The world is a shifting, unstable, and entirely magnificent place, and we are but temporary, transient figures in its long and slow history. We act as if we are the masters of the landscape, as if we are the ones who decide where the shoreline shall be, but the shoreline is a liar. It is a shifting, deceitful, and ever-changing line that marks the boundary between the manageable and the absolute. And when the hurricane comes, the shoreline moves, and it doesn't bother to notify the zoning commission. I suspect that if I were to go down to Miami today, I would find the people already busy at work, clearing the debris, rebuilding the piers, and starting the whole process over again. They have the memory of a goldfish and the persistence of a colony of ants. They have already forgotten the lessons of the storm, because the storm is the one thing they cannot monetize, and therefore it is the one thing that does not exist in their world. They will build the hotels, they will sell the lots, and they will wait for the next inevitable and entirely predictable catastrophe, all while assuring their customers that the danger has passed and that this time it is different. It is a grand, dizzying, and thoroughly human comedy. We are like children building sandcastles at the edge of the incoming tide, absolutely convinced that our towers will hold, that our moats will protect us, and that the ocean is too polite to ruin our work. And when the wave finally comes, we are shocked. We are genuinely deeply offended that the ocean did not honor our territorial claim. I shall stay in the mountains, I think. The mountains, too, have a habit of shifting, and they have a way of reminding you of your own insignificance that is far more permanent and far more instructive than the coast. But there is something to be said for the drama of the shore. There is something to be said for the sheer, defiant, and thoroughly reckless act of building a city in the middle of a hurricane's favorite playground. It is a triumph of the human spirit over the evidence of the senses, a victory of the dream over the reality, and a comedy of such immense proportions that it makes all the other stories of the year look like small, quiet, and altogether polite affairs. So, let the developers build. Let the investors buy. Let the hotels rise from the sand like white, stuccoed mushrooms in the wake of the rain. It is a show that never truly ends, a performance that is repeated every generation, and a lesson that is never, ever truly learned. And if you are lucky enough to be sitting in the audience, watching the wave hit the shore and the dream wash away, do yourself a favor. Enjoy the spectacle. It is the most honest thing that ever happens in Florida, and it is the only time the scenery is truly, authentically, and refreshingly real. The rest of the time, it's just a lie, a beautiful, palm-lined, and altogether flimsy lie that we are all in our heart of hearts desperate to believe, and that, I suppose, is the greatest joke of all. We are the ones who pay for the tickets to our own destruction, and we applaud the ending, even as we are being swept out to sea. It is a performance worth the price of admission, even if the price is everything you own. Chapter 20, 1927, is priming its ticker. We have reached the end of this current headlong sprint through the year 1926, a year that, if it were a man, would be currently sitting in a darkened corner of a train station, clutching a suitcase with a broken handle and wondering if he should have stayed home. It has been a year of peculiar inventions, of strikes that ended in a very polite silence, of bears that made us feel better about our anxieties, and of hurricanes that reminded us that the earth is not our servant, no matter how many land deeds we manage to scribble our names upon. We have seen the talkies start to clear their throats and the politicians start to sharpen their smiles. And we have watched the world grow smaller, louder, and significantly more complicated than it was when the calendar first turned its page back in January. Now, as the shadow of 1927 looms on the horizon, the air is thick with the smell of new beginnings and the faint, unmistakable, and utterly terrifying scent of a catastrophe waiting to be born. The world, you see, is like a steam engine that has been running on the same coal for a decade. It is rattling, it is shaking, and it is beginning to emit the sort of high-pitched metallic screams that suggest the pressure gauge has long since been pegged against the stop. Mr. Henry Ford, that great, stubborn, and utterly relentless mechanic of the American dream, is currently locked away in his shop, designing the Model A. He knows, as surely as the sun knows its orbit, that the Model T, that beloved, cranky, and thoroughly democratic chariot of the common man, has had its day. The world is moving on to flashier things, to sleeker lines, and to engines that don't require the strength of a gorilla to turn over on a cold morning. He is building the replacement, a car that will be faster, quieter, and inevitably a bit more expensive to keep in repair. It is the story of our lives. We are forever trading the things we know, the things we understand, and the things that break in ways we can fix, for the things that are faster, shinier, and guaranteed to baffle us once the hood is lifted. Meanwhile, in the dim, dusty, and altogether unwholesome corners of the Department of Justice, J. Edgar Hoover is filling his cabinets. He is collecting folders, he is recording names, and he is building a repository of secrets that will eventually grow into a mountain of dossiers so large that it will dwarf the actual laws of the land. He is a man who understands that, in the modern world, information is a form of currency, and that if you know enough about a man's petty indiscretions, you don't need a judge to keep him in line. He is the librarian of our collective human frailty, and he is currently cataloging the entries for the year ahead. It is a grim, quiet, and profoundly effective way to ensure that the enlightened piece stays exactly where he wants it, on a leash. The stock market, that great, swirling, and altogether mythical casino of the modern era, is rising. It is rising with the grace of a hot air balloon that has been filled with nothing but optimism, helium, and the collective desire of 1,000,000 people to get rich without having to perform any actual labor. It floats above the city, tethered only by the thinnest of threads, drifting closer and closer to the fireworks factory, and every person in the street is looking up at it and wishing they had a ticket for the ride. They do not see the heat rising from the ground. They do not see the frayed edges of the rope. They only see the gold, and they are convinced that the climb will go on forever. It is a spectacle of such monumental, breathtaking, and entirely predictable greed that one can only stand back, shake one's head, and wait for the gravity to do its inevitable, thankless work. And then there is the matter of the Atlantic. It is currently serving as a giant, indifferent, and altogether moist stage for a young fellow named Charles Lindbergh. He is out there in some hangar in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by blueprints, engineers, and enough coffee to keep an entire regiment awake for a week. He is buying maps of the ocean, studying the weather reports, and staring at his airplane with the intensity of a man who is about to be either the most famous person on the planet or a very expensive, very wet, and very anonymous footnote in the history of the sea. He doesn't know it yet, but he is about to turn the Atlantic into a mere puddle, a bridge between two worlds, and he is about to ignite a fire of obsession that will burn for the rest of the century. I look at the world as it stands on the brink of 1927, and I see a society that is primed, calibrated, and perfectly set for a grand sweeping collision with its own ambitions. We have the technology, we have the appetite, and we have the collective unshakable belief that we are the masters of our own destiny. We are so very busy being modern that we have forgotten the oldest, simplest, and most fundamental lesson of all, that the world is a giant, shifting, and altogether indifferent machine that does not care about your stock portfolios, your dossiers, or your flight plans. We are priming the ticker, aren't we? We are winding the spring, setting the gears, and preparing for a cycle that will be faster, louder, and more spectacular than anything we have yet witnessed. We are entering an era of mass-produced, high-speed, and high-stakes chaos. And the irony, of course, is that we will call it progress. We will celebrate the speed, we will applaud the volume, and we will toast the cleverness of the machines, all while the ground beneath our feet begins to buckle and the rope holding our balloon begins to snap. It is a grand, dizzying, and thoroughly whimsical way to live, but I find I am beginning to grow tired of the ride. I am a man who prefers a slower pace, a bit of silence, and a bit of time to actually think about what is happening before it happens. But the world doesn't want my thoughts. The world wants to move. It wants to roar. It wants to climb. And it wants to hit the fireworks factory at the highest possible speed. So I shall sit here in my corner with my pen and my ink, and I shall watch. I shall watch the cars get faster. I shall watch the files get thicker, and I shall watch the balloon get higher. I shall watch as the young pilot takes his chance with the ocean, and I shall watch as the bankers take their chances with the market. It is a show that has been running for a long time, and I know how the final act usually goes, even if I have to endure a few more years of the noise to see it. It is a tragedy, really, for those who are caught in the gears, but for those of us who have the luxury of observing from the balcony, it is the most entertaining story ever told. It is a story of human pride, human folly, and the sheer unquenchable and utterly ridiculous desire to be more than we are. And if the price of that story is a bit of chaos, a bit of ruin, and a bit of a crash, well, then it is a price we have always been willing to pay. As for 1927, I wish it the best of luck. It is going to need it. It is inheriting a world that is spinning out of control, fueled by the dreams of the greedy and the desperate efforts of the clever, and it is going to have to find its own way through the dark. I suspect it will be a year of surprises, a year of shocks, and a year that will leave us all wondering what the devil we were thinking. But that is the beauty of it. It is the next page, the next chapter, and the next chance for us to prove once and for all that we have learned absolutely nothing at all. And if that isn't the most human thing you have ever heard, then I don't know what is. The clock is ticking, the ticker is priming, and the stage is set. We are all waiting in our own quiet and thoroughly anxious ways for the show to begin. I, for one, shall be in my seat. I have seen the play before, but I am still curious to see who gets the last laugh. My bet is on the ocean. It has seen the most, and it has the most patience. It is the only thing that ever truly wins in the end. The end. This has been Digital Twain.